Bai Zemin knew the journey to reunite with his family wouldn't be easy. If the university grounds, familiar and enclosed, were already teeming with danger, the outside world would be infinitely worse. Streets filled with rampant animals, hordes of zombies, and unknown threats waited beyond these walls. Still, no matter how long the road or high the risk, he had to go. That was his goal, his anchor. Now that he had the strength to contend with first-order creatures, Bai Zemin no longer felt as helpless as he had when he faced the blazing beetle. He wanted to leave the university soon, very soon. But with Shangwan Bing Shui discovering the keys to several school buses, he was willing to delay his departure for a couple more days. With vehicles, the trip could be faster, safer. "All right," he said with a nod, accepting her suggestion without argument. "Just remember the group's rules. Break them, and you'll pay with your share of rations." Without waiting for a reply, Bai Zemin turned and headed toward the stairwell, leaving the others behind. "He just ignored me completely," Chun-Hee muttered, half laughing and half resentful. "Aren't I one of the top fighters too? Why does he only say that stuff to Bing Shui?" Gao Min, Li Na, and Fan Wu shared a look before Wu Yiju and giggled lightly. "Isn't it obvious? If Bing Shui agrees, you'll follow along. No need to convince you separately." Chun-Hee coughed, cheeks slightly flushed, and gave her a helpless smile. "All right, enough teasing," Shangwan Bing Shui sighed as she rubbed her temples. "Let's move. I need proper sleep before I collapse." The survivors, once ruled by Qiaolong, along with the rescued female students, were now under the direction of the new leadership. Bai Zemin, Shangwan Bing Shui, Chun-Hee, Liang Peng, Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, and Zhongde. Kong Lan, who only possessed a healing ability, remained close to Bai Zemin for safety. With such a large group and few capable fighters, they had to move slowly. Chun-Hee and Fu Xiefeng led ahead, sweeping the path for any stray infected. The area had been clear before, but new threats could appear at any time. Before returning to the gym, the group, now numbering over 300, stopped once more the restaurant they had previously visited. With so many mouths to feed, it was essential to stock up. They took everything, even perishable goods. The survivors carried what they could, knowing the food would last at least a few days, even without proper storage. Liang Peng and Zhongde each held a massive freezer on their shoulders to preserve what they could. The strain forced Zhongde to rest every time his power boost skill ended, while Liang Peng rotated the load with other male students, working in teams to shoulder the burden. By the time they returned to the gym, the sun had nearly dipped below the horizon. Yet despite the exhaustion, a meeting was called. Bai Zemin stood near the wall, arms crossed. "We can't keep doing this," he said grimly. "What do you mean?" asked Jia Jiao confused. "He means we can't stay here," Wu Yijun interjected, stepping in smoothly. Though she had no combat power, she had a sharp mind and Shangwan Bing Shui support. No one challenged her place at the table. Bai Zemin nodded, staring out the window. "We're over 500 now. We don't even have proper beds. Only the girls were lucky enough to get clean clothes after we swept the female dorms. The men? Nothing yet. It's not just that," Chun-Hee added. "The lighting here is poor. The atmosphere is heavy. If we stay much longer, people will start cracking under the pressure." There was a moment of silence. Then Shangwan Bing Shui spoke, her voice clear and steady. "Then it's settled. In 2 days, we move south. On the way, we'll clear the nearby buildings and move what mattresses we can from the dorms." Everyone nodded in agreement. It aligned perfectly with Bai Zemin's own plan, so he raised no objection. The meeting dispersed soon after. One by one, the leaders left, except for one. Bai Zemin remained. Or rather, he wasn't truly alone. "Lilith, come take a look at this." His voice had shifted, no longer calm and commanding. It was excited, almost childlike. The indifference that usually cloaked his face had melted away as he sat by the window, calling out softly to the woman who had been quietly observing everything. Lilith smiled as she approached, the hint of roses lingering in her scent as her jet-black hair shimmered in the dim light. It was rare to see Bai Zemin like this, and she relished the moment. "Let's see what has you acting so cute," she teased gently, holding out her hand. Bai Zemin reached out and took her hand, voluntarily for the first time. The only other times they had touched were either accidental or beyond his control. Now, as he held her hand, he marveled at the softness of her skin. It was like touching something that shouldn't exist, something beyond this broken world. But he didn't linger on the sensation. He closed his eyes and focused. Within him, the soul power from everything he had defeated surged to life. Zombies, mutated dogs, that terrifying cat, and the First Order blazing beetle. Record after record flashed in his mind, cycling through like data on a screen, until he found the one he was searching for. And there, amidst the chaos of memory and power, something awaited him. Something new. Here it is, Bai Zemin murmured, eyes lighting up with rare excitement. He would have rubbed his hands together, if not for the fact that one of them was still clasped gently around Lilith's. You have acquired the soul power of First Order Anti-Magic Zombie, level 33. Agility plus 50, stamina plus 47, health plus 32, mana plus 24, strength plus 11. You have leveled up and reached level 22. You receive 2 status points to distribute freely. You have leveled up. You have leveled up. You have leveled up and reached level 25. You receive 2 status points to distribute freely. You cannot reach level 26 before obtaining your first job and evolving to First Order. All further soul power acquired will be recorded and calculated after successful advancement. All accumulated soul power has been calculated. You may now choose one of the following jobs: swordsman, mage, assassin, mechanic, blacksmith, martial warrior, blood berserker. Bai Zemin's eyes scanned the messages hovering within his retina. The moment he absorbed the soul power of the blue-skinned zombie, these system prompts had begun pouring in, one after another, like cascading revelations from the heavens. He hadn't even noticed Shangwan Bingshui or Chuni back then. All of his attention had been locked onto this. He had reached it, the threshold, the evolution to the First Order, finally within his grasp. According to Lilith, reaching the First Order was the first true step toward becoming an evolver. It separated survivors from real combatants. And now, Bai Zemin stood at that crossroads. 7 job choices. Lilith's blood-red eyes widened with intrigue. A subtle glint of surprise flickered behind her composed expression. That's unusual? Bai Zemin asked, his gaze not leaving the floating options. Lilith looked at him for a long second before exhaling softly. Her smile was enigmatic, equal parts admiration and disbelief. It's very unusual. Most people are given 3 options. First, they're especially gifted. But you? 7. And among them, I sense a special job and a unique job. A unique job? Bai Zemin raised an eyebrow and met her eyes. Sounds important. She gave a small nod. It is. Special jobs are rare, born from unique experiences or high compatibility. But unique jobs are in a class of their own. They are exclusive, singular. No other being can obtain that class while you live. They're shaped by a path never walked before, carved by your essence, your battles, your choices. Bai Zemin fell silent, absorbing every word. A job made only for him. A class that would never appear again in anyone else's system. So, he said slowly, what do you think? Lilith smiled. It wasn't playful this time. It was warm, genuinely proud. I can give you a breakdown, she said thoughtfully. But in the end, the decision is yours. She began to list them. Swordsman. You've used a sword as your main weapon until now. This class will likely enhance your sword mastery, increase your precision, and boost the lethality of your slashes. Mage. Ideal if you want to amplify your magic skills. Stronger magic, possibly shorter cooldowns. Appear due to your high mana and recent combat experience with magical enemies. Assassin. This likely appeared because of your special forces skill. It would increase your stealth, perception, and critical strike ability. You'd move like a shadow. Mechanic. Useful in practical ways. You'd gain skills to repair or upgrade vehicles and machinery, probably tied to your past life experience before the soul record arrived. Blacksmith. This is a special class. You could forge weapons using monster materials. Rare, very few get it. Likely appeared due to your pre-apocalypse job and current strength. Martial warrior. A balanced and common class. Boosts close-range combat ability. Nothing exceptional, but reliable. Lilith paused before continuing with the final one. Blood Berserker. This is something I've never seen. Berserker classes are rare, but not unknown. Yet Blood Berserker, that's different. It's likely the unique class. There's only one other person I know who became a Berserker, and he rose to the Fourth Order in just 6 centuries. Bai Zemin blinked. 600 years. Is that even possible? Lilith's crimson gaze turned serious. If you live long enough to reach the realm of higher existences, then yes. You'll remain in your prime indefinitely. Age will become irrelevant. Immortality will no longer be a myth, but a fact of your existence. That image, eternal youth and strength, set something ablaze in Bai Zemin's heart. But the fire quickly dimmed. To live forever, while watching those you love wither and die? What meaning did immortality hold if you were doomed to walk alone? No. He clenched his jaw. That was not the kind of eternity he wanted. If his family wasn't safe, if he couldn't protect the ones he cared about, what point was there in eternal life? I'll become stronger. Strong enough to protect everything I love. Strong enough to rewrite the rules if I have to. He took a deep breath, letting the fire settle in his soul. There would be time to consider the distant future. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered. Choosing his path. Turning to Lilith, he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Let's see what this test has in store for me. And with that, he focused on the message again, ready to step into the unknown.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
After taking a deep breath and calming his emotions that seemed to want to get out of control, Bai Zemin looked directly into Lilith's eyes again and nodded. Please continue. Good. Lilith smiled slightly, seemingly satisfied with his attitude, and continued. As I was telling you before, the Berserker job is very strong, and the power boost that such a human obtained allowed him to become an existence to what is called a world power, since upon reaching the Fourth Order, even the weakest existence possesses the power to protect a race or devastate one. Bai Zemin did not know what to say about this, so he simply continued to listen. Possess the power to wipe out an entire race? Something like that was too difficult for the current Bai Zemin to even minimally imagine. Even nuclear bombs, which were mankind's strongest weapon, did not have the ability to wipe out an entire race. Something of such magnitude was too distant for the current him. However, you obtained a job called Blood Berserker, so it is undoubtedly more powerful than that other lower existences, or at least it will be as it progresses since your job even has a distinctive word in it. Lilith looked at Bai Zemin with a serious expression, the most serious he had seen so far, and warned, if what you desire is power and a path that will likely lead you to a better destiny, then you know what to choose. However, be very careful. Careful? Careful of what? He asked, confused but alert. If I'm not mistaken, this job appeared as a consequence of your way of using your blood manipulation skill. Remember what I told you before? It seemed like you were about to create a new skill during your battle against that First Order zombie. Lilith furrowed her eyebrows slightly, and upon seeing him nod, she continued, it's likely that this unique job is the answer to what you were missing. You'll probably gain a powerful active skill, but at the same time, you'll have to pay the price for it. It is also likely that you will have to face an extremely hard trial to advance. Bai Zemin closed his eyes and paused to think carefully. It would be a lie to say that he didn't feel a touch of worry. After all, he was just a human, and until 6 days ago, he was nothing more than an ordinary student working part-time to pay for his day-to-day life. However, it was just that, a touch of worry. Bai Zemin opened his eyes again and smiled slightly as he said, it has been 6 days since the world changed and society collapsed. In those 6 days, I faced thousands of dangerous creatures. I had 3 battles in which I almost lost my life. In one of them, I won with relative ease. In the second, I was critically injured. And in the third, every second I spent swinging my sword was the same as being 1 second closer to being infected or decapitated. If it were before all this, maybe, just maybe, I would worry about difficulties or personal losses. But at this point, what difference does it make? Besides, there is something else that Bai Zemin didn't say out loud. If he didn't choose a strong job, how could he repay Lilith in the future for all she had done for him so far? And what if, because of his caution, he reached a breaking point where he no longer had the ability to care for the safety of his loved ones? Bai Zemin would regret it for the rest of his life if such a thing happened. Since choosing the Blood Berserker class was equivalent to walking an unknown path, it would surely be filled with thorns. However, that thorn-filled path would probably lead him to a better destination than if he chose a path that someone else had walked before. The advantage? Lilith had said it before. A unique job, and one with a distinctive word in it, would definitely be stronger than a normal one. However, there were also disadvantages. For example, no one knew what awaited ahead until you got there. Still, you have chosen Blood Berserker as your first-order job. Berserkers are the existences that fight to the end in every battle without retreat and without fear in the face of death. The path of the Blood Berserker is a path that one who wishes to become the god of war must traverse, a path where defeat is not allowed. This is a job that has only been given to you, who has never retreated from battle and who has never been defeated after facing enemies far stronger than you. To advance to First Order and show that you meet the necessary qualifications to become a Blood Berserker, you must meet the next requirements. Kill unranked enemies using blood manipulation with a single attack. 0 out of 100. Kill First Order enemy using blood manipulation on yourself. 0/2. Kill First Order enemy with a single attack using blood manipulation on yourself. 0/1. What? Bai Zemin couldn't help but exclaim as his face turned as pale as a sheet. The first requirement was something he could accept and could accomplish with ease. The second requirement was naturally more difficult than the first requirement, but the current Bai Zemin was confident that he could accomplish it. After all, he was no longer the same Bai Zemin who could barely defeat the First Order Blazing Beetle. The current him was 2 or 3 times more powerful than him back then, as he had absorbed vast amounts of soul power purer than his own. However, the third requirement was simply insane. Insane to say the least. To kill a First Order enemy in a single attack? Even irrationality should have limits. What sense did it make to ask someone whose level was 25 and had not even advanced to the First Order to kill a First Order existence with a single attack? To instantly kill an existence that had officially begun to evolve. Against the First Order Blazing Beetle, Bai Zemin was almost killed, and against the First Order Anti-Magic Zombie, he managed to win after a tough battle, and even then he received some help. But now he needed to kill one of those existences instantly. Lilith was also surprised and could not help but hold her breath. Even she, who had her fair share of experience in life, had never seen something similar. Skipping levels to defeat and kill existences of a higher order was rare, and probably only less than 1% of all creatures in the universe could realize such a feat, since the difference between the orders was like a natural rift. However, to kill a First Order existence in one strike, even First Order existences did not have many chances to instantly kill another First Order existence, but Bai Zemin, who was still an unranked person, had to complete such a requirement, or else he would not be able to advance in level anymore. All soul power received by him would be stored in the records of the soul record, and unless he managed to fulfill the evolution requirements, he would also not be able to acquire stats by defeating other creatures, so he would stagnate without being able to become stronger. In short, the risk and loss were immeasurable. Both Bai Zemin and Lilith remained in absolute silence as they continued to stare at the green message flashing in his retina. It was almost as if they were waiting for the message to change as a roadside promotional message would. Too bad. Reality was what was before them, and it could not be changed. Hey, Miss Higher Existence. Bai Zemin couldn't help but look at Lilith and ask with a frown, "What's up with this? How can I possibly be given a crazy mission like that?" Asking an unranked existence to defeat and kill a First Order creature was already crazy enough, but this was another level. Lilith took a deep breath, causing her already prominent breasts to puff out even more as if they wanted to break free from the thin piece of silky cloth that cruelly contained them. However, Bai Zemin, who was the only person capable of witnessing such a sight, was in no mood for such a thing. This is the first time in my entire life that I've ever seen anything like this. She answered honestly and looked at Bai Zemin with complete sincerity as she said, "Forget about seeing something like that. I've never heard of anyone having to face such a cruel challenge in their first job advancement." "Haha, I knew it." Bai Zemin laughed dejectedly, and his shoulders slumped slightly as he leaned his head against the wall, sighing in exhaustion. Now that he couldn't absorb any more soul power or level up, he could only somehow manage to try to meet those absurd evolution requirements, or else only death would await him when his level and order fell behind the evolved creatures and humans. "Do you regret choosing that class?" she asked as she stared at him, and at the same time gently squeezed his hand, which still clung to hers without letting go. Bai Zemin did not even hesitate and shook his head. "No, I don't regret it. It's just that I didn't expect something like this." In the end, he smiled bitterly. Regret? He had no regrets whatsoever, as he knew this was the best possible path to choose. But the difficulty was simply abysmal, and that was what was giving him a headache. "Let me tell you something that will perhaps lighten your spirits." Lilith turned his face gently with the palm of her hand to look at her, causing his eyes to shudder slightly before returning to normal. He was inwardly cursing this seductively beautiful woman and at his useless skill. How was it harder for the opposite sex to affect his heart? He could barely control himself from blushing like a teenager. Little did Bai Zemin know how incredible it was to manage to remain calm with her touching his body directly, and how rare it was for an existence to maintain sanity after smelling the rose scent of her body, as well as how difficult it was not to get lost in the depths of her red eyes. Worse yet, all this was even more difficult for the male sex. It is true that the test the soul record imposed on you to advance to First Order is hard, probably the hardest in the entire history of the universe. Lilith narrowed her eyes, and a small, almost imperceptible smile appeared at the corner of her beautiful lips as she slowly said, "However, Bai Zemin, don't you think that such a high challenge was imposed on you because the reward you will get is worth it?" Bai Zemin's eyes lit up slightly as he listened to her words. Indeed, the test was difficult to the point where it could be considered an impossible one. But wouldn't the amount of power obtained be equivalent to that difficulty? Even in role-playing games or in real life, it was like that. The best-paying jobs were often the ones with the most responsibilities. An airline pilot earned a lot of money, but in their hands were the lives of hundreds of people. An anesthetist earned a lot of money, but they had to study for dozens of years, and a small overdose was enough to kill a patient and go to prison for many years. A person had to be willing to risk if they wanted to win, or else they could just be someone normal with no right to complain. "Go on." He nodded. "Besides, let me tell you a secret." Lilith moved closer to him, making him for a moment think she was going to kiss him. However, she moved beyond his face and stopped by his ear, whispering softly, "From what I've heard and for what I've learned over the years, even the God of the Bible didn't have to face such an extreme test at the beginning of evolution." "Do you know what this means?" a with-grave newbie. Her warm breath caressed his ear, and he could feel the sweet scent of her lips. However, Bai Zemin's brain could not revel in any of this as it was currently processing what Lilith had just told him. Who was the God of the Bible? While it was true that there were several religions in the world and many different gods were worshipped, Christianity was the most popular religion among human beings. The God of the Bible was a divine existence, worshipped by hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. However, even the God of the Bible had not received such an extreme test in his first steps to become a divinity respected and worshipped by countless others, and was probably worshipped and respected in countless other worlds. What did this mean? It meant that Bai Zemin had the potential to surpass him. What the soul record was telling him by imposing such a harsh and cruel test on him was basically that in order to reach a level where he would be peerless and without paragon, Bai Zemin needed to prove that he was worthy of such a thing. Bai Zemin took a deep breath and had to remain silent for more than a full minute to calm his agitated heart. After all, who wouldn't want power? Power enough to stand at the absolute top and dominate myriad races, rule and enforce their voice. Lilith, you sure know how to lift people's spirits." He shook his head and looked at her, surprised to realize how close her face was and how perfect she was from this distance. "How about giving me a reward?" She looked up at him with innocent eyes and blinked several times. Unconsciously, he looked at her lips, but something inside him told him that if he gave in here, he would probably regret it much later in the future. "TSK. Get off me, you perverted woman." He pulled away slowly and clicked his tongue. "Ah." Lilith blinked, and her eyes had a strange glint in them. After a moment of silence, she looked down at Bai Zemin's crotch and muttered, "MMH. Considering how big that bulge is down there, there doesn't seem to be a problem with your manhood. Could it be that my charm is waning?" Bai Zemin couldn't help but follow her gaze, and when he noticed the small tent between his pants, he blushed slightly. "I swear, someday I'll make you regret for teasing me." He gritted his teeth and spoke softly as he looked at her, as if she was his worst enemy. Lilith puckered her lips and said with some seductive expectation, "Don't make me wait for too long, then. I can't wait for you to make me regret. Kill a first-order existence with a single attack? Leave it to me." Bai Zemin felt his blood boil to the brim as he thought this. "Now let's see what this is." After calming down, Bai Zemin took the yellow orb out of his coat pocket and looked at it with a touch of joy. "I almost forgot about you, baby. Why do I feel you like that, or more than me?" Lilith didn't know whether to laugh or cry, seeing the warmth in his eyes as he looked at the treasure orb. "Humph. You just wait, and you will see what is good for you." Bai Zemin merely snorted before forcefully crushing the orb in his hands. How could he not be excited? This was a magic-grade treasure after all. Flash. After a deep yellow flash of light, a new object appeared on the table in front of Bai Zemin. The object was actually a bronze-colored ring with many strange-looking engravings on it, and at first glance, it didn't seem to be anything too special. Another ring. Bai Zemin was slightly surprised before grabbing inquisitively at the object. Rejection ring. Magic-grade treasure possesses the power to reject elements created by matter. When equipped, it automatically increases magic plus 15 and mana plus 15. For 5 minutes every day, you can use the active skill Reverse Trajectory. Reverse Trajectory creates a barrier that blocks, repels, and returns any object shot to you towards the launcher regardless of the distance. The power of the barrier depends on the magic power of the user and the object blocked. It has a cooldown time of 12 hours. "Oh." Bai Zemin raised an eyebrow, somewhat puzzled. The item itself was good, as it not only granted a total of 30 stat points, but also had a skill attached to it. But the skill was a bit strange, so Bai Zemin had no way of knowing how strong it was until he tried it. "Well, we'd better go get something to eat." When this thought flashed in his mind, he couldn't help but stop to look at Lilith. But when he was about to ask if she didn't need to eat, he suddenly felt a bit stupid, so he decided to leave quietly. She was too distant in existence. How could she possibly need to eat? He hadn't even seen her feel thirsty during these 6 days together. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A temporary sort of kitchen had been set up in a corner of the basketball court. A huge pot was being simmered while a group of female students and some male students formed a group to wash and chop vegetables, cut meat, cook rice, and arrange bowls for each person after taking a head count. When Bai Zemin came out of the cafeteria, some people began to whisper in low voices while looking at him with a touch of fear and caution. However, in the midst of these people, there were also many others who looked at him with gratitude and relief. While it was true that many feared him after seeing how he unhesitatingly threw a live person into the zombies and the rumor spread with several alterations, many others were grateful that with someone strong like him and the rest here, everyone's life was a little more secure. In addition, when the female dormitory students were rescued, all the other survivors who had been rescued at the beginning of the apocalypse realized that compared to them, there were people who were starving to death out there. Seeing that the food was being prepared, Bai Zemin stood silently on the side as he thought of ways to become stronger and how he could overcome the challenge that the soul record imposed on him. After he calmed down, he realized that while the mission was difficult, it was not impossible. If it were someone else, it would probably be impossible. But for him who had already faced, defeated, and killed 2 first-order creatures, it was not an insurmountable abyss. All he had to do was come up with a plan that would allow him to kill his enemy with a single attack, and since the mission did not give a clear specification of the method, Bai Zemin could think of ways to achieve that goal. While he was thinking and deep in thought, a sweet, jasmine-like scent approached him, followed by a gentle breeze. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Bai Zemin raised his head and looked at the person who had just spoken to him. You must not know my name yet, do you? My name is Wu Yijuan." She smiled politely, and seeing him move to the side to make room, she sat down with grace. "During the day, I didn't have time to thank you properly for earlier. I would like to give you my thanks." Bai Zemin raised an eyebrow and couldn't help but remark, "I think I said it before, but if you want to thank someone, you should thank Shangwan Bing Shui, not me." Wu Yijuan chuckled and shook her head. While it may be true that the idea was hers and she used that unknown favor you owed her, the reality is that you could have refused and Bing Shui couldn't have forced you. Besides, it's not like saying thank you to the person who cleaned up a zombie nest is a bad thing, is it? That's the least I can do." Bai Zemin shrugged and didn't comment anymore. Seeing that he remained silent and didn't try to engage her in conversation, Wu Yijuan couldn't help but raise her eyebrow slightly in surprise. Before the apocalypse, all men, regardless their age, would try to chat with her, either because of her beauty or because of her family background. Now that the gates of the apocalypse were opened, men were still trying to court her even under these conditions, as since she came to this place, no less than 60 male students approached her. NB Epsilon. Therefore, Wu Yijuan could not help but be slightly surprised, as she could tell that the young man of the same age beside her was not trying to act interesting or mysterious to get her attention, but really had no interest in her beauty or any kind of side interest. One interesting man. Now I understand why Chun He, who is always proud of himself, suddenly feels so cautious. Wu Yijuan secretly laughed, and her impression of him couldn't help but improve a notch. Come to think of it. Bai Zemin suddenly stood up, and his eyes shone brightly. Are you okay?" Wu Yijuan couldn't help but ask with a frown, and unconsciously looked towards the door, fearful that it would be knocked down by some creature. "No, it's nothing," he answered vaguely and sat back down. However, his mouth curved into an almost invisible smile. "Maybe, just maybe, if I do it that way, I can really complete this damn mission." Bai Zemin was excited as his thoughts seemed to have paid off. His mood improved to the point where he didn't care about anything and started to chat with Wu Yijuan informally while waiting for the food to be ready. If his idea really was valid and worked, then all his worries could be completely ignored. Of course, he had to do a lot of work first and get certain things needed to carry out his plan, but having a clear path to follow was good enough considering that an hour ago, he was getting desperate. In another corner of the basketball court, Chun He, Shengwan Bing Shui, Gao Min, Li Na, and Fan Wu were sitting chatting quietly while waiting for the food to be ready. Yijuan said she was only going to thank him, but apparently she stayed chatting. And seeing how she is currently smiling despite the situation we are in, it looks like she is having fun. Chun He said casually as he looked towards the corner where Bai Zemin and Wu Yijuan were sitting together. Gao Min, Li Na, and Fan Wu looked at each other with complicated eyes. The three of them had heard the rumors about Bai Zemin's actions during the day, but the difference was that they knew the reality of the matters after Shangwan Bing Shui, and Chun He told them the truth. Still, it was difficult for them, who had not seen human cruelty yet, to understand how someone could do such a thing. Of course, it was only a matter of time before they learned that not only zombies and animals had turned into wild creatures. Shangwan Bing Shui frowned slightly as she gazed at the scene of the two people chatting, and a moment later she sighed. "I hope Yujin isn't playing around as she did in the past. I don't think Bai Zemin is a person to play with." Chun He chuckled and said with a touch of speculation, "Who knows? Maybe the two of them will end up together?" While Bai Zemin's personal background may not be anything special, his personal strength in this world is enough to be respected. Even Yijuan's family might accept him, don't you think? "Who knows?" Shangwan Bing Shui replied, without much apparent interest, and closed her eyes. Meanwhile, Chun He was secretly overjoyed. Wu Yijuan was a beautiful, charming, and intelligent woman. He didn't think any healthy man could resist her for too long as she wanted him to. That way, His worries about the woman he loved would not be necessary. Dinner was served and consisted of rice with sautéed vegetables as well as a piece of meat. However, the differences, dealings, preferences, and rules established by the group showed up immediately. In a slightly secluded corner of the basketball court, a group of about 5 friends had gathered and were currently looking at the food in their hands with a hint of discomfort. Why can they eat meat, but we can only eat rice? A student complained as he mashed the white rice in his bowl with his chopsticks. These people's food bowls consisted of pure white rice and nothing else. There wasn't even a vegetable in their bowls, let alone precious, nutrient-rich meat. Isn't it all because of that stupid rule? Another scoffed as he put the white rice into his mouth and chewed without much desire. That Bai Zemin guy already said it. Those who aren't willing to go out to fight or look for food can only settle with leftovers. Going out to fight those zombies? Only a stupid person would do something so risky. Another student who was almost 6 feet tall couldn't help but curse as he said, "Since there are some retards playing superheroes, then let them be. Who in their right mind would leave the comfort and convenience of this place to go looking for food too?" Xiong Wang is right. A glasses-wearing, cold-eyed student who had remained silent pointed out, Bai Zemin is too full of himself. But people are unlikely to tolerate this kind of difference for too long. The group of friends looked around and realized that there were indeed several people who were receiving the same treatment as them, unhappy with the difference in food distribution. This discontent was only growing more and more with the scornful looks the people eating white rice were receiving from those who had vegetables and a piece of meat in their bowls. Although the food was now not especially scarce and was enough to feed the group of now over 400 survivors for 2 weeks if they were wasteful and for a month if they were careful, the rule that Bai Zemin had suggested forcibly implementing still took place. Therefore, before distributing the food, each person was questioned as to whether they were willing to do logistical work to support those who were actively fighting on the front lines. Arnu, those who were willing to work could eat better food and even satiate themselves, unlike those who were not willing to leave the safety of the gymnasium. Of course, those who fought could eat the best food available and could eat at will as well as control supplies. For example, Gao Min, Li Na, Fan Wu, and Wu Yijuan currently brought nothing special to the group. However, with the support of Chunhe and Shangwan Bing Shui, all 4 could enjoy the treatment of one person who did work. Such differences in treatment naturally caused a small commotion among the survivors, as it was the first time such a thing had happened since the beginning of the apocalypse. If you don't want to eat, don't eat. Stop talking big. A female voice interrupted the group of complaining friends. When they turned around, they saw 2 girls looking at them coldly and carrying a bowl of white rice in their hands. "You girls are also just eating white rice, but you support that guy?" The student who had spoken first looked at them as if they were crazy. "We were saved from the female dormitory by Big Brother Bai, Big Sister Shangwan, Big Brother Chun, and Big Brother Peng. Unlike you, the 2 of us know the meaning of not biting the hand that feeds us." The same girl looked at them in disgust. "Nice tone you got there for a coward." The glasses-wearing student snorted and raised his voice. The girl was about to get angry when her friend pulled her arm gently and stopped her. The second girl looked at the group of 5 and sneered coldly. "You guys really don't know what's good. If you guys knew how scary it is to feel hungry for almost a whole week, I'm sure you'd be crawling like dogs to beg for a bowl of white rice like the one you're disdaining right now." The first girl's name was Ling Ming, and the second girl's name was Xiao Rong. Both were freshmen, and in the past, they also had their share of suitors as they were quite pretty. However, when the world changed, they were stuck on the 3rd floor of the female dormitory, and when they called for help through the window during the first day, all those men who swore to protect them fled like chickens. After starving for almost a whole week and having realized that beauty and empty words were no longer as important as actions and true strength, Ling Ming and Xiao Rong had matured a lot to the point that even as new students they were wiser than this group of 3rd-year male students. The argument slowly began to get out of hand to the point where more people began to join the fray, and the voices that were previously a whisper now began to turn into shouts of anger and shaming. "What did you say, you little piece of crap? I said you're a coward." That's why you're eating what you're eating while I'm getting better stuff than you. You're just turning into a show-off dog, but you're still a dog. Better to be a dog that can show off instead of just being a dog. The verbal brawl spread from the two freshmen and the group of 5 friends to the surrounding area, and it was getting more and more out of control. Those who ate the best things began to show their superiority to those who ate the worst, and those who ate the worst began to mock those who ate the best. Since the world had changed 6 days ago, all these people had been locked up practically without seeing any sunlight except the rays that passed through the small windows with metal bars. The confinement, coupled with the occasional distant roar of some mutated beasts and the fear of knowing that death was constantly lurking over their heads, had caused all these people who didn't even have a comfortable place to sleep to accumulate massive amounts of stress to the point where it only took a small drop for the glass to overflow. Now that a small flare of conflict had finally been ignited, everyone began to argue over insignificant matters in an attempt to release all the pent-up frustration and shake off the fear that was weighing on their shoulders. Bai Zemin observed everything silently from his place and continued to eat his dinner as if he was not concerned about anything that was happening. Wu Yijuan raised an eyebrow at the sudden disturbance and looked at Bai Zemin before carefully asking, "Won't you stop them?" "No need." He shook his head before pointing forward and said lightly, "The charming prince and the beautiful princess will do it anyway." The charming prince and the beautiful princess? Wu Yijuan followed Bai Zemin's gaze and finally understood what he was talking about. You're pretty funny, he. She couldn't help but shake her head and giggled as she saw Shangwan Bingshui and Chun He walking towards the center of the conflict. Bai Zemin unconsciously stopped his eating movements and looked at the woman sitting beside him out of the corner of his eye. Funny? He is? That is something new. Bai Zemin shook his head and continued eating his dinner while looking ahead. Shangwan Bingshui had a deep frown on her face, while Chun He looked somewhat worried at what was happening. Both of them came from big families, so they knew very well that in times of crisis, internal disputes were the beginning of the end. If at this point they could not stand together, then it was unlikely that humanity could overcome this challenge, as they would not only be attacked from the exterior, but would also collapse from inside. The scandal had reached a point where the intermingled voices made it impossible to understand what the others were saying, and so no one noticed the duo approaching either. "Everyone, shut up once and for all!" A deep voice thundered like lightning in the middle of the night, and the voices that seemed too loud before were squashed, as if it was nothing. The timpani of the people closest to the shout began to ache, and they could feel a slight whistling sound as a result. The person who had shouted was, of course, Chun He. As someone whose level was considerably high and had been constantly evolving and fighting, his entire general body was at least 5 or 6 times more powerful than that of a normal person. It's Chun He and Shangwan Bingshui. I think we went a little overboard. Seeing the dark expression on Chun He's usually gentle face and the even colder than usual expression on Shangwan Bingshui's face, some people couldn't help but be scared after realizing what they had just done. NB Epsilon. Seeing that everyone was silent, Chun He swept through the crowd of survivors with a sullen expression and said in a loud voice, "You are all idiots? Don't you realize that all this commotion caused by you could attract powerful creatures from the surrounding area? We haven't even cleared all the surroundings, and only the northern area of this place is relatively safe." Since they had only moved to the pharmacy and the restaurant in search of supplies, only the vicinity of those 2 places were considered safe. However, the south, west, and east of the gym were still surrounded by all kinds of creatures and tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of zombies. Chun He had already witnessed with his own eyes how terrifying a first-order existence was, and knew that if 2 or more of those creatures appeared, then most, if not all of the survivors in this place would be slaughtered without being able to defend themselves. They all lowered their heads in fear, not daring to protest. Although many might turn savage and disagree, none dared to say it out loud. "Someone want to explain to me what happened here?" Shangwan Bingshui finally asked the core question of the matter as she looked at people's faces one by one waiting for an answer. "Big Sister Bing, it all started because of this ungrateful person." Xiao Rong stepped forward and pointed at the first student who complained. Ling Ming also stepped forward and supported her friend. That's right, this person and his friends are ungrateful. Not only do they talk behind others' backs like cowards, but they also don't know how to appreciate the kindness given to them selflessly. The pointed student turned pale, and the group of friends beside him looked at the two girls with bloodshot eyes, as if they wanted to eat their flesh. Is that true? Chinny asked with a frown and looked at the group of 5 sternly. You'd better tell the truth. Currently we have too many external problems to tolerate internal problems as well. Tell me what your name is and explain how all this fuss happened so we can try to find a solution. The young man gritted his teeth and looked at Bai Zemin, who was still keeping his head down and eating with a beautiful woman beside him. Eventually, gathering his courage, the young man looked at Chun He and Shangwan Bing Shui and said in a straight voice, My name is Pei Feng, a third-year student in the economics department. The reason for all this commotion is because of the rule he put up earlier. Shangwan Bing Shui sighed internally, and even without Pei Feng saying more, she already knew what the core of all this trouble was. She looked at him and said indifferently, Are you talking about the rule masterminded by Bai Zemin in which supplies are distributed based on contribution? Pei Feng seemed to have calmed down after the initial fear and nodded without hesitation. He looked at everyone present and said loudly, That's right, that nonsense rule. I'm sure everyone here is secretly upset about the whole thing. I mean, come on. Who in their right mind would be willing to go out there where a mutated mosquito could suddenly appear and dry us to death? Even those who agreed to go out there for the sake of eating their fill surely agree with me, but agreed to do it for obligation. Some people lowered their heads, and others began to whisper to each other after hearing Pei Wang's words. No one could deny that the words he had just said were true to some extent. After all, who was really willing to risk their lives unless it was extremely necessary to do so? In fact, most of the students who had died so far had died because they had not dared to fight even when the zombies had cornered them and left them with no way out. Even among the people who had agreed to go out to do logistical work, there were some who only did it so that they could eat their fill and not for any other special reason. If they had to choose, they would naturally prefer to stay in the safest place possible. That was all you wanted to say? Shangwan Bing Shui nodded slowly after Pei Wang finished his speech and looked at him with the same indifferent expression that made it difficult to know what her thoughts were. That's right. Pei Wang nodded, now feeling more confident seeing that no one was refuting his previous words. We would like to receive the same treatment as everyone else. After all, if no one present wants to work, it's not as if we can be forced, is it? Or what? Are we going to be left to starve? Shangwan Bing Shui sighed exhaustedly and looked at Pei Wang as if he was dumb. I don't think anyone here is starving. In the past, people worked and earned salaries depending on their efforts, and now that society fell into chaos, people still have to collaborate to make things work somehow. Since money is worth little in our current situation, food is the best currency. You want to eat better, then work and earn it. Saying that, Shangwan Bing Shui turned around and was about to leave, but suddenly stopped and looked at Pei Wang coldly. Just one more thing. If any of you dare to speak anything bad behind the backs of us who keep your young skins healthy, then you'd better prepare yourself for the consequences. Chinny looked at everyone present and added, If any of you disagree with our rules, then you can leave. No one is holding you against your will. I'm sure you'll come back begging for mercy when you meet a zombie out there. After saying that, Chinny turned around and followed Shangwan Bing Shui, not before looking at Bai Zemin, who continued to eat his dinner without caring about the opinion of others. If it was before, Chun he would not say such words. But he was gradually adapting to this new world, and although it was not easy, he knew it was necessary if he wanted this group to have some kind of order. Otherwise, if everyone did what they wanted, everything would become a disaster before they knew it. Pei Wang's face turned pale as he realized that his words carried no weight in this situation. Even if the other survivors agreed with him, so what? No one would ever be willing to support him, no matter what, since they needed the main fighters to survive. Now do you understand? Know your place. Xiao Rong looked at him like a clown before turning around and walking as far away from the place as possible. Even a dog doesn't bite the hand that feeds it. Are you still human or what? Ling Ming gave him a look of disgust before snorting and following her friend with no intention of staying close to such a person. Not only did the two girls give him scornful looks, but all the others who ate white rice, just like him, also gave him the same look and walked away. Before, they belonged to the same group who were displeased and dissatisfied with the new food distribution rule. But now that even Shengwan Bing Shui and Chun he had sided with Bai Zemin without hesitation, none of these survivors dared to stay by Pei Wang's side for fear of being labeled as ungrateful people, and the treatment they received would get even worse. To Pei Wang's horror, even his close group of friends looked at him with a touch of shame before turning and walking away with their bowls of rice. The place fell silent under a strange and slightly heavy atmosphere for a few seconds before a casual and indifferent voice broke the silence. This meat sure is good." Everyone followed the source of the voice and saw how Bai Zemin set his bowl aside before slowly standing up. He looked at Pei Wang with a slight smile, and without saying anything turned around and walked away silently. What else could he do? Continue the matter when everything had already been made clear? Wasn't that lowering himself to the level of a cowardly and insignificant ant? Bai Zemin had better things to do, and Pei Wang's little act could never affect him in any way. With graven beta. A moment later, Wu Yijuan's voice reached everyone's ears. Just a reminder to you, as you seem not to realize the current situation. The rules no longer exist here. The society has really fallen, and even the central government of China does not respond, since even I, the granddaughter of the Prime Minister, is in these circumstances. I advise you out of kindness not to provoke the limits of patience of a person whose strength is probably the highest among us all. Believe me, you are all very lucky to be able to have food in your stomachs, and you should appreciate and be grateful for that. After saying those words, Wu Yijuan looked at Pei Wang coldly before walking toward Shengwan Bing Shui and her group. At first, everyone was astonished and dumbfounded to learn of Wu Yijuan's true identity. Soon, however, that astonishment and surprise turned to horror, because if what she said was true and she really was the granddaughter of the Chinese Prime Minister, the fact that she is here and even had to starve for almost a full week meant that the central government was really in big trouble, or otherwise her family would already be here looking for her. Besides, Wu Yujin's words had another implication, and that was that Bai Zemin had already thrown one person into the zombies before. Another one probably wouldn't make a difference to him. Therefore, it was better to be obedient and not cause trouble unnecessarily. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Humans really are despicable. Lilith giggled disdainfully as she rocked her dainty feet gently. Currently, she was sitting on a large marble table, watching Bai Zemin's actions curiously. Indeed, but not just humans. I think any intelligent race would be just as greedy. Not all. I have known races to act for a single general purpose, though it is rare. Damn aliens. By the way, Bai Zemin, what are you doing? You mean this? Bai Zemin took off the blazing ring and the hurricane necklace, leaving them on the table, and as he inspected them, a smile appeared on his face. These two objects are the first two keys that will open the door of evolution for me. The night of the 6th day since the beginning of the apocalypse ended without too much noise and nothing of note, except for the occasional terrifying roar of some distant creature. With the descent of the first ray of sunlight, the 7th day since the arrival of the soul record on Earth finally officially began, being a week since the world had changed and society had fallen. When Bai Zemin met with the other group leaders and his subordinates, the survivors were being awakened by the teachers one by one. Without too much delay, and wanting to make the most of the light that the day provided, a simple breakfast was prepared consisting of a steamed bun for those who were not willing to work, 2 buns for those who were willing to work, and 2 buns along with a carton of milk for the fighters. Wu Yijuan looked at the milk carton in her hands and could not help but feel bitter inside. In the past, she would never taste packaged milk in China because cases of people getting cancer were common, and she absolutely never drank anything but imported milk. However, after 6 days of experiencing hunger, this little princess had learned that the world of the past no longer existed, and with pain at the changes, she drank the milk with pleasure. Whoever adapted the fastest was most likely to live, and Wu Yijuan was not willing to die no matter what she had to do to survive as long as she could maintain her dignity as a woman. After breakfast, Shengwan Bing Shuel Yang Peng. In Chen, he chose a group of about 50 or 60 people from among the survivors willing to work and cautiously set off of the pharmacy to start removing the first-order blazing beetle shell and arranging the meat, not before checking whether it was ingestible or not. Let's go. It's time to get to work. Bai Zemin glanced as the group of survivors disappeared around the corner of a building before looking at the three people beside him. Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, and Zhongde were standing as they looked at him with hidden reverence. The three of them had witnessed how horrifying the First Order evolved zombie was, and among the four strongest evolved people in the group, only Bai Zemin was able to suppress it, while Shengwan Bing Shui could barely contain it after the zombie had lost one of its blades. Currently, Bai Zemin's four subordinates were approximately level 5 or level 6, and the more they leveled up and the more stats they obtained, the more they realized how immense his strength was, and the more the respect they had for him increased, as well as the gratitude they felt towards him for allowing them to safely obtain such power. The three nodded with determined expressions, and Bai Zemin also nodded in satisfaction before turning around and walking in the opposite direction for where the large group of survivors led by Shengwan Bing Shui had left. While Shengwan Bing Shui's group worked on the flesh of the First-Order beetle, Bai Zemin and his group would take it upon themselves to start clearing the path to the south of the university, eliminating the zombies and other creatures that might appear in the vicinity. As for Konglan, Bai Zemin left her in the gymnasium to taking care of the supplies since he did not trust any of the survivors. He assured her that tomorrow someone else would take her place, and she could level up as well to avoid unnecessary discontent. Fu Xiefeng, together with Kai Jingyi and Zhongde, separated from Bai Zemin and began to move as a group in the western area. Fu Xiefeng was using 2 large kitchen blades as he really wanted to get used to handling dagger-like weapons. On the other hand, Kai Jingyi and Zhongde both had iron pipes that had been polished at the ends, so it was extremely sharp to pierce through the low defenses of the zombies. Even if a level 9 or 10 mutated dog appeared, with the 3 of them being level 5 or 6 teaming up, they could easily buy time for Bai Zemin to arrive on the scene, so as long as an agility-based monster or a high-level creature didn't appear, they should be fine on their own. The 3 of them did a wonderful job, as when one of them exhausted much of their stamina, another person would take the place of the exhausted one to allow them to rest. Slowly and surely, the zombies in the southwest area began to be annihilated one by 3 people who were previously no more than normal survivors, but thanks to their bravery and courage were given the great opportunity to become evolved human beings. Meanwhile, Bai Zemin was taking care of annihilating any enemy living beings on the southeast side of the gymnasium, slowly moving towards the south of the university. Although he could do a much faster task if he wanted to, currently, and taking advantage of the rare opportunity when there was no one around, Bai Zemin was practicing with his blood manipulation skill and trying to control the mana inside his body as optimally as possible. 3 zombies sniffed the air, and their ears seemed to twitch before their lifeless white eyes looked forward. With 3 growls similar to that of a hungry beast, the 3 zombies began to advance towards the source of life a few meters away, regardless of who was stronger or weaker. Bai Zemin made no effort to hide his presence, nor did he try to silence his footsteps, letting the zombies notice him. Seeing the 3 zombies a bit more than 10 meters away approaching, he stopped his steps and slowly took out a bottle of blood from his backpack. After dropping about 3/4 of the bottle on the paved ground, he stopped and took a deep breath before concentrating entirely on the blood, ignoring the zombies. He imagined 3 thin but powerful piercing spears at the tip as he began to circulate the mana inside. A few seconds later, 3 red spears of approximately 1 meter were lying on the ground, and the liquid blood was nowhere to be seen. The 3 red spears looked like real spears that were forged by the hands of blacksmith, and it would be hard for anyone to think that a few seconds ago they were just a puddle of liquid blood, because although they had no special decoration, they were really well formed. With a wave of his hand, The 3 spears were enveloped by a wave of mana and floated in the air before shooting out towards the zombies, stabbing their heads with precise aim. Bai Zemin frowned in dissatisfaction. In fact, he had spent only 3 mana points to create the blood spears, and another 3 more to mobilize them. Considering that before he spent at least 20 points, it was a considerable improvement. However, the problem was the time. Bai Zemin had taken almost 20 seconds to move his mana carefully while imagining the process of creating the spears, and that was too long. Under this circumstance, it was fine since the zombies were only 3 and slow, but in real combat, he could not afford such a thing. No, the time is not the only problem. Bai Zemin shook his head, and the frown on his face deepened as he realized that things were even more complicated than they appeared to be at first. The time was the main problem, since currently his enemies were only 3 low-level zombies that moved at the speed of a turtle. But even if they were moving slow, if the number of zombies was overwhelmingly high to the point where while Bai Zemin took care of killing some others would have already closed the distance, then nothing would be meaningful. But another problem that Bai Zemin almost overlooked was concentration. In this situation, it was fine as he knew the weaknesses and strengths of the enemy he was facing. However, was it possible to do something like this against enemies unknown to him? The answer that Bai Zemin got after considering every detail carefully was a resounding no. How could he, while striving to keep his body intact and without suffering as many injuries as possible, even have time to focus on creating and imagining the shape of a weapon or object and then mobilize his mana carefully while moving around the battlefield? Doing so many tasks at the same time was not only extremely difficult, but could also cause him to lose focus on his own safety for an instant, and in that instant, his life could be over. It really is hard. He sighed as he scratched his head before continuing to move forward in a southeast direction. Whenever small groups of zombies appeared, Bai Zemin used them as guinea pigs to practice his control over mana to reduce the amount of concentration he needed to optimally mobilize it. At the same time, he was trying to figure out the best way to imagine the formation of blood spears. Instead of constantly changing the weapon's form, Bai Zemin had come to the conclusion that it was better to master one form first before focusing on others. His first-order blood manipulation skill was powerful against living enemies capable of feeling pain. However, while it was possible to use it to shape and control blood from liquid to solid state, the difficulty was very great as it depended 100% on Bai Zemin's imagination. During the conversion process, he needed to imagine the process of creating the weapon to shape it, and doing that in the middle of combat was not easy. In fact, the reason he was able to do it more easily was probably thanks to his work before the apocalypse broke out, or the difficulty would be several layers more. As Bai Zemin advanced, occasionally groups of zombies formed by several dozens would appear, and there was even a larger group formed by 100 zombies that had gotten stuck in one of the paths, but when they sensed his presence, they began to attack him. In such cases, Bai Zemin wielded the Xianyuan sword as he moved in and out of the group of zombies, separating the heads from their bodies and forming pools of blood. Even after he filled several 2-liter bottles with blood, there was still blood everywhere he passed by, and the decapitated corpses of the zombies began to accumulate very fast. On the other hand, while Bai Zemin was having a headache trying to multitask, Lilith was watching everything sitting on top of a building. Her beautiful face had a small smile on it, and her lazy eyes looked at the human who occasionally kicked the lifeless corpses to release some frustration. Even to me, it took me a full year to get used to the existence of mana back then, but you already have an initial idea of how to control it and use it at will. Yet you still have the nerve to complain? Big Sister is really looking forward to punishing you, little Zemin hee, she whispered to herself before chuckling secretly. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In the north of the gymnasium, the complete opposite direction from where Bai Zemin and his 3 subordinates were currently located, the giant elephant beetle was being dismantled from its shell slowly under the constant efforts of 50 people. The beetle's shell was tough to the point that even Bai Zemin wielding his sword that was capable of piercing through the defenses of almost any creature below level 40 would need time to break through it. However, Now that the First Order blazing beetle had been dead for several days, and its defenses had dropped tremendously after Bai Zemin absorbed some of its soul power, the shell was no longer as attached to the flesh as in the past. Using the hole that Bai Zemin had made the day before when he struck hard using Liang Peng's heavy hammer and taking advantage of the cracks that extended through the creature's armor, the survivors began to use knives, iron pipes, and any other object that could be used as leverage. Alpha. They lifted the shell slightly, and using the small space created, the others quickly cut the flesh, thus splitting the shell apart. On the ground, there was a large pile of metal-like objects already forming a small mountain about a meter high. This was, of course, the remains of the shell that had been successfully pulled off. As the survivors worked, standing on the third floor of the pharmacy, Wu Yijuan, Gao Min, Li Na, Xinwan Bing Shui, Chun He, and Liang Peng looked down. Some of them with curious looks, others with indifference, and others inspecting the surroundings just in case. So, do you want to use this monster's shell to do something special? Wu Yijuan asked while narrowing her eyes with a mischievous glint in them. Shangwan Bing Shui nodded slightly and slowly explained, "During breakfast today, Bai Zemin told me to keep the shell instead of throwing it away, since when we leave here, he could put it to good use. Besides, we can also use it as metal plates to protect the buses when we clear the exit road." "Oh, Bing Shui, could it be that you had some private meeting with him?" Wu Yijuan held back laughter and asked in surprise, "At what point did something like that happen? Private meeting?" Shangwan Bing Shui furrowed her eyebrows and shook her head as she said in bewilderment, "No, we only exchanged a couple of words before we went our separate ways, with him going south and us going north." "But, Yijuan, why do you ask that? Anyway, that meat sure looks tender and soft." Chinny suddenly interjected the conversation and pointed to the beetle meat that looked delicious even when uncooked. The people inside the building looked at him with strange eyes, and Shangwan Bing Shui couldn't help but ask, "Chun-He, I didn't know you were a lover of beetle meat." Chun-He's face froze and began to blush furiously as he felt as if everyone's eyes were poking him while Shangwan Bing Shui's words were the final stab. Ha 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 ha. Wu Yijuan finally couldn't hold back the laughter anymore and started laughing while saying through tears and laughter, "Chun-He, you're too obvious." When Wu Yijuan burst out laughing, Liang Peng finally started laughing while looking at Chun-He as if he was an idiot. Eventually, after being dumbfounded for a moment, the handsome young archer finally understood that his other childhood friend had played a bad joke on him. Since Wu Yijuan knew perfectly well that Chun-He saw Bai Zemin as a potential enemy for the affection of his childhood crush, but she said such words to tease him, it was obvious what her intentions were. Yijuan knew. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he secretly looked at Shangwan Bing Shui. Unfortunately, he was only disappointed to notice that her expression was as cold and indifferent as ever. She looked at the scene with a hard-to-read expression and secretly shook her head. Shangwan Bing Shui knew that Wu Yijuan was a person who, when the atmosphere was bad, liked to joke to ease the tension. Even so, the joke was indeed a bit awkward. "Is there any change with the test subject who ingested the flesh of the First Order beetle?" Shangwan Bing Shui asked, not dwelling on the matter from before and immediately forgetting about it. "For now, there is no change at all." Wu Yijuan's face finally became serious, and she looked towards the small enclosed room as she said, "It's already been 4 hours, but there hasn't even been any change in those people. Do you want to wait more time, just in case, Bing Shui?" Shangwan Bing Shui nodded and said indifferently, "That's right. Let's wait until nightfall, and if there are no negative changes, then we'll let them go right away as promised." Liang Peng looked at Shangwan Bing Shui and could not help but secretly shudder as he realized that under that cold and indifferent face was actually a cruel woman. The test subject she was talking about was actually 3 of Qiaolong's lackeys who had also abused other people by making use of their position as bootlickers. However, after Qiaolong was defeated and killed by Zemin's group, those 3 lackeys became prisoners of war. Although Shangwan Bing Shui wanted to kill them all, she was a pretty smart woman capable of seeing the big picture of the world. Therefore, after deliberating with herself, She came up with the idea of using these people as guinea pigs to test the flesh of the first-order elephant beetle and see if any kind of mutation or malformation happened in any of the three subjects. Shangwan Bingshue's idea was approved by Bai Zemin and Liang Peng without hesitation, and although he still felt it was not right, he finally agreed. When they told the three male students that they had abused of Qiaolong's power, naturally none of them agreed to become guinea pigs and taste the beetle's flesh. After all, who in their right mind would be willing to eat something that could kill them or turn them into some kind of weird creature? Unfortunately for the three guys, none of them had too many options to choose from, as Bai Zemin threatened to throw them alive into the zombies if they didn't want to do the job. Seizing the opportunity, Shangwan Bingshue had promised that as long as nothing bad happened to them, she would let them go and no one would stop them. Under the cold stare of Bai Zemin, who did not seem to be lying when he said he would throw them into the zombies just as he had done before with Qiaolong, and under the allied hand extended by Shangwan Bingshue, the three male students obediently became guinea pigs. However, Liang Peng did not expect that she would still be so cunning and cruel. If she released them at night, when the danger multiplied infinitely, the already slim chances of survival that the three test subjects had in case they passed the project would plummet even further. Seeing her cold and indifferent expression remain unchanged, Liang Peng finally realized that the woman in front of him had never intended to let those three men live from the beginning. Bai Zemin was cruel and ruthless enough to throw a living, sentient person into the midst of the zombies while he watched them being eaten alive with an impassive expression. However, Shangwan Bingshue was not necessarily inferior to how cruel he was. The people in the room looked at her in different ways, some with fear, some with concern, some with understanding, and various complex emotions. However, Shangwan Bingshue seemed unconcerned by all this and continued to supervise that the survivors did not slack off and work properly while protecting them from danger. Time passed quickly, and on the side where the survivors were working on the beetle's shell and flesh, nothing worth special had happened. Not even a single zombie had appeared in the vicinity, as they had all been slaughtered by the main fighters of the group after so many battles and walks back and forth between this area and the gym. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the survivors began to slow down the speed at which they were moving their hands, so the work began to fall behind time. Gao Min, Lina, Fan Wu, sorry to bother you, but could you go call the people who are working? Tell them the food is ready and they can all eat their fill. Wu Yijuan noticed the change immediately and asked her friends to take care of informing the 50 survivors who were working. All right. The three girls nodded naturally and stood up without hesitation. Now that things had changed, they knew that they needed to at least do simple tasks if they didn't want to be despised by everyone. Wu Yujin herself even went downstairs and headed to the temporary kitchen that had been set up on site to check how the other work was going. There a group of about 10 female students and teachers, who had temporarily become the group's cooks, were making lunch. I'll go tell Bai Zemin that the food is ready. Shangwan Bingshue walked towards the window as she said, "It's been about 7 hours since he's been killing zombies, and he probably needs to replenish his energy as well, or he won't be able to sustain himself for the rest of the day." Bingshue. Chunni called out to her, and she stopped before looking back with doubtful eyes. What's wrong? Hearing her voice as cold as ice, Chunni hesitated to say that he would go for her to look for Bai Zemin. In the end, he shook his head and said with a worried look, "You be careful." Shangwan Bingshue looked at him for a few seconds before turning around and saying in the same voice as always, "Don't worry. I'm not as weak as I may seem." With nothing more to say and without waiting for a response, she jumped out of the window and floated like a butterfly until her feet touched the ground before her speed burst, disappearing from everyone's sight within seconds. On the other hand, Bai Zemin spent all morning, noon, and 2 or 3 hours of the afternoon eliminating zombie after zombie without rest. The same was true for Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, and Zhongde, who were taking care of the opposite flank that he was dealing with. However, while Bai Zemin was doing well due to his high stamina, which had reached a horrendous point being his highest body stats, the same could not be said for Kai Jingyi and the other two. After fighting constantly for several hours, The stamina of the group of three could not keep up with their pace, as even taking turns and slowing down the charge was difficult for them. Although they had killed a few zombies and had advanced in level to approximately level 8 or 9, mental fatigue was causing everyone's stamina to drop at higher rates than normal. With no other choice, Bai Zemin's three subordinates abandoned the separate hunt and walked towards the southeastern area, following the traces of blood and zombie corpses to find him and get some rest as they really needed it, or else they might end up suffering unnecessary injuries, or even worse, getting scratched by a zombie and getting infected in the process. After walking and searching for several minutes, the three finally felt the sound of several zombies growling, as well as the thud of bodies and heads constantly falling to the ground. The three looked at each other before rushing forward, and after running for 2 blocks and rounding a corner, their footsteps stopped dead in their tracks as they saw the scene before them. Bai Zemin's body was like a leaf swaying in the wind of a raging storm as he ran through a wave of over 500 zombies. For a second, he was on one side, but in the next instant, his body seemed to become a blur before he appeared in a different place, followed by dozens of zombie heads flying through the air. Swoosh, 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 bang, 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 bang. The sound of the wind being cut in two by the blade of the Xianyuan sword, as well as the bangs caused by Bai Zemin's kicks connecting against the skulls of the zombies and turning them into minced meat, echoed throughout the block, and the echo traveled through the nearby buildings. Because Bai Zemin mostly used his sword, few people actually knew the fact that he was actually extremely skilled in all kinds of martial arts, and only Shengwan Bingshui, Liang Peng, and Shun had seen him in the cafeteria the first day they arrived at the gym. But the reality was that currently every part of his body was a deadly weapon capable of taking the lives of his enemies in a matter of seconds, and that thanks to his nearly 100 strength points, a kick from him was not something that a normal living being could handle. Under the frightened and shocked gaze of Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, and Zhongde, the small horde of about 600 zombies was completely decimated and crushed in 5 minutes. In fact, if it were not for the zombies being so crowded together and hindering Bai Zemin's ghostly mobility, the zombies would have been eliminated far quicker, as they could not even catch Bai Zemin's shadow, and his movements were too explosive, since before the zombies could react, their heads had already been crushed with a kick or gone flying through the air after a slash from a sword. Phew! Bai Zemin let out a loud and exaggerated exhale as he thought that it would be better not to attract so many zombies in close quarters, as his mobility was greatly affected, and until he could control mana properly and gain some mastery over his blood manipulation skill, his agility was his strongest weapon against numerous but weak enemies. Oh! Bai Zemin turned around and was a bit surprised when he saw the trio standing several meters away. Guys, what's wrong? Kai Jingyi was the first to react to Bai Zemin's call. She walked forward and began to explain why they had come, being followed closely by Fu Xiefeng and Zhongde. Bai Zemin listened to her words as he casually nodded and told them not to worry too much and congratulated them on their good work. However, his attention was focused on the steps the three of them were taking. Regardless of whether it was Fu Xiefeng, Zhongde, or Kai Jingyi, the steps of the three of them were steady, and from the way she spoke without trembling, it seemed that she was not scared or fearful of anything in particular. To many, this might be insignificant, but to Bai Zemin, who had acquired the experience of the best special forces soldiers on Earth, seeing 3 people who were previously just normal students going through a pool of blood and hundreds of corpses without flinching was something to be praised. If it was in the past, just seeing the bloody scene before them would be enough to scare them to death. Yet here they were, walking among decomposing corpses as if it was no big deal. Of course, Bai Zemin knew that such a thing was possible only because the 3 of them had been fighting zombies constantly ever since he granted them the opportunity to absorb soul power and open the gates of evolution for them. Therefore, after killing so many zombies, after seeing so much blood and so many deaths, Kai Jingyi and the other 2 had grown accustomed to the iron smell of blood in the air, and their eyes contained a hint of steadiness that was not present before. Bai Zemin was naturally secretly delighted, as the more prominent they were, the better it would be for his long-term plans. Roar! Suddenly a furious roar echoed through the surroundings, startling the 4 people present. "Be careful and stay close to me." Bai Zemin's face changed slightly, but Kai Jingyi's face and his other 2 subordinates turned pale while their legs grew weak, threatening to fall down at any moment. "That's definitely a first-order creature." Lilith, who had been watching from afar in boredom, seemed to perk up a bit as she floated several meters into the sky while looking down. "Bai Zemin, now you'll see that if it's you, the soul record test isn't as impossible as it seems." The scarlet eyes of the beautiful succubus glittered with a hint of anticipation as she observed a shadow move between the buildings in the direction of the group of 4. It with graven ES. Without hesitation, Bai Zemin activated his blood manipulation skill on himself as he imagined the terrifying scene of his family being killed. Adrenaline was a substance that the body secreted on its own and was not something he himself could control. Therefore, because Bai Zemin was no longer scared of low-level first-order existences, he had no choice but to improvise in order to somehow control how to produce that substance that he so badly needed to fulfill the requirements of evolution and at the same time improve his battle ability for a short period of time. Therefore, although it was unpleasant and he did not even want to think about his family being killed, at this moment, they were the only trigger capable of triggering his fears to extreme levels enough to spiral out of control. Fueled by anger and fear, he gritted his teeth as his organism began to secrete large amounts of adrenaline, a substance which was carried at twice the normal speed by the accelerated blood and moving through every part and nerve of his body by the blood vessels that pulsed like the heart of a living being after swelling to match the wild bloodstream. Kill unranked enemies using blood manipulation with a single attack. 100 out of 100. Kill first-order enemy using blood manipulation on yourself. 0/2. Kill first-order enemy with a single attack using blood manipulation on yourself. 0/1. The simplest requirement had already been completed, and Bai Zemin was aiming for the second and third. Since in both cases the activation of blood manipulation on himself was required, he did so without hesitation. His pupils became half their normal size, amplifying his range of vision. His body became lighter and more flexible, making it easier for him to move in risky situations. His whole being seemed to be in a strange condition, ready to face any kind of danger that threatened his existence. Kai Jingyi, Fu Xiefeng, and Zhongde had no idea what was happening, but after the previous roar, every cell in their body seemed to have gone crazy as fear had almost completely overwhelmed them. This alone was enough to let them know that whatever roared at that moment was definitely not something they could currently stand against. What the group of 3 did was to approach Bai Zemin and stand only a step or 2 away, just behind him as they looked around cautiously, raising their weapons in an effort to make themselves feel better. Unlike them, Bai Zemin seemed much more relaxed. His body was in a calm posture, and even his sword was not on guard to defend against any imminent attack. He just stood there, his tiny pupils absorbing more information about the surroundings than any normal person could imagine. Swoosh! Suddenly, there was a minuscule sound of wind. It was as if the wind had been cut by an extremely swift object. Bai Zemin turned his head slightly to the left and caught a glimpse of a silhouette rounding the corner of the nearby building before charging towards the group at surprising speeds. This creature was even faster than the First Order's evolved zombie, and even after absorbing so much soul power and with a speed comparable to that of 12 people, Bai Zemin still could not keep track of the incoming enemy. However, while speed was one of the most powerful weapons in existence, it was not necessarily impossible to fight against. Swoosh! Surprisingly, the unknown First-Order creature's first target was not to attack Bai Zemin, but aimed at Zhong, probably due to the fact that he was the closest to the corner from which the creature appeared. Without moving his head, Bai Zemin's eyes moved to the left, and for less than a split second his cold gaze met a pair of golden eyes filled with murderous intent. Just as the strange creature passed by him, Bai Zemin slashed with his right hand from below upwards as he began to turn his body. The First-Order creature quickly realized that if it continued on its current path, it would be seriously wounded by the enemy blade, so without hesitation it tilted its body to the side, evading the enemy's slash by just a few inches. However, Bai Zemin already expected something like this to happen given the creature's fast movement speed, and his sword movement was just a feint. The real attack was in the turn he had just completed during that small fraction of a second when the creature stopped its movements to avoid being cut. After completing a 90-degree turn, Bai Zemin's body was now right in front of the first-order creature, and because the creature had just twisted its body to dodge his sword, Bai Zemin's leg connected fiercely with the enemy's abdomen. Bang! After being ferociously hit by the 96 strength points that kick contained and not expecting such a thing, the unknown creature was sent flying 10 meters before impacting against the wall of the adjacent building. Howl! Amidst the collapsed rubble, Bai Zemin and his subordinates finally caught a glimpse of the body of Tiger that was over 5 feet tall with grayish-black fur. The beast could not help but raise its head and howl painfully as it squirmed to its feet. Obviously, Bai Zemin's previous kick had caused a fair amount of damage to the mutated tiger's internal organs. Bai Zemin knew that the enemy's speed was faster than his, so he rushed forward like a whirlwind. In less than a second, the short distance of 10 meters was completely closed. Raising the Xinyuan sword, he slashed again at the same time as his body moved strangely. The mutated tiger ignored the pain and jumped to the left, successfully evading the slash. However, before its golden eyes, the elbow of Bai Zemin's left arm grew bigger and bigger until it finally connected against its head. RN. Bang! The tiger's body was buried in the ground next to Bai Zemin at the same time as some bones of the skull cracked due to the blow. However, the first-order creature did not even have time to react to the pain before the next attacks came. Slash! Slash! With 2 clean slashes, the 2 front paws of the mutated tiger were almost completely hacked off. Immediately after, Bai Zemin jumped into the air and positioned himself on top of the tiger's body that was howling in pain. Following this, he stabbed with the tip of the sword and pierced the monster's skull, successfully destroying the brain. However, although it was already dead, the tiger's body was shaking from nerves, and its almost completely severed front paws struck the empty air in front of it. This was precisely the reason why Bai Zemin had positioned himself behind the enemy before killing it, or else he would have been hit and probably injured unnecessarily. You have acquired the soul power of First Order Shadow Tiger, level 38. You cannot level up or obtain additional stats before you get the First Order job. A message similar, but at the same time different from the ones he had received in the past flashed in by Zemin's retina. However, he was dumbfounded and paid no attention to it. Is it over? The Shadow Tiger, a creature of First Order and with such a high level, had died, just like that? Bai Zemin could not believe it. Not long ago, he had almost been killed by the First Order Blazing Beetle that was several levels lower than a monster he had just killed so easily. For a moment, it was hard for him to adjust to the change. High in the sky, Lilith had a bright smile on her face, and her eyes shone like stars in the night sky. "Little Zemin, Big Sister loves you to death," she whispered to herself. A First-Order creature was nothing in Lilith's eyes, and just one look was enough to wipe out an entire army. However, when she was still an unclassified existence, she could not do what Bai Zemin had just done. No, not only she could not. Probably no one in all recorded history was ever able to kill an enemy who was in a higher order in less than 3 seconds. Less than 3 seconds. That was the time it took Bai Zemin to end the life of the First-Order Shadow Tiger. So, if he really gave it his all and gave up the defense to attack, who said it was impossible to slay a First-Order existence with a single attack? Lilith looked forward to it. She looked forward to his growth and couldn't wait to see how far he would go in the future if he didn't fall before he was fully grown. Bai Zemin was the greatest genius she had ever known in her entire life, and most likely the greatest in history. However, Lilith had seen countless outstanding geniuses falling from the sky like shooting stars before they were fully grown. Therefore, it was better to be careful, because even the biggest ones could fall by a mistake or carelessness. Kai Jingyi, Fu Xiefeng, and Zhongde stood a few feet away with expressions that openly showed how dumbfounded and shocked they were by the way the events unfolded. Seeing Bai Zemin standing over the body of the First Order Shadow Tiger, None of the three knew how to react to what had just happened. To Kai Jing-yi and the rest, the battle between Bai Zemin and the First Order Shadow Tiger was simply a battle between gods, since from the point of view of the three of them, the speed and force displaced by both existences were things they could not comprehend, even now that they had become evolved humans. The Shadow Tiger's ghostly speed was undoubtedly astonishing, but what was more astonishing to the three of them had been Bai Zemin's ability to react. He suppressed the Shadow Tiger's speed completely just by relying on three factors: reaction ability, strength, battle instinct. Little did they actually know that Bai Zemin had not even given his 100% in the previous battle. Slowly, Bai Zemin climbed down from the corpse of the Shadow Tiger and sighed secretly. Multitasking while he was concentrating on the battlefield and the enemy's movements was really a challenge. If he could get used to his blood manipulation skill and mana, he could not only use the skill on himself, but he could also create weapons to bombard the enemy and restrain them and attack them from inside to outside. Unfortunately, doing such a thing while he was in the middle of a fight was not at all simple and definitely not something that could be learned in a week's time. Forget it. I'll get better at it little by little. My strength and control over blood manipulation have already improved tremendously compared to the first day of the apocalypse. Bai Zemin stopped lamenting and decided to be a bit more optimistic as he made a small but deep cut on the beast's abdomen and began to collect the blood inside. He even emptied some bottles that had blood from normal creatures and exchanged it for the blood of the Shadow Tiger, since although he wasn't sure, Bai Zemin guessed that the blood of a first-order creature should be better than that of an unclassified existence in some manners. While he was on that, he decided to check his two most important evolution processes so far. First, his evolution process to First Order. Kill unranked enemies using blood manipulation with a single attack. 100 out of 100. Kill First Order enemy using blood manipulation on yourself. 1/2. Kill First Order enemy with a single attack using blood manipulation on yourself. 0/1. Indeed, he only needed to fulfill 1.5 more requirements to advance successfully. The next thing he decided to check was the progress in the evolution process of his blood manipulation skill. Collect 100 liters of blood from 50 enemies level 5 or higher. 68 out of 100. Collect 10 liters of blood from 5 first-order enemies. 6 out of 10. Collect 1 liter of blood from 1 second-order enemy. 0 to 1. A week ago, such requirements were far from possible, and it seemed that it would take a lifetime to fulfill all of them. However, today, a week later, except for the last requirement, the other two were only a matter of time before they were completed. New ES. These small details showed Bai Zemin how strong he had become, while constantly reminding him that he should not be complacent, because somewhere out there were existences capable of wiping out his 20 years of life and effort in a second. After collecting a good amount of blood from the Shadow Tiger, Bai Zemin picked up the 2 orbs from the ground with a complicated look. When he killed the blazing beetle, he acquired a skill scroll, and 3 orbs of which one of them was magic grade. After defeating and killing the anti-magic zombie, the beast dropped 3 orbs, and one of them was magic grade as well. But now that he had killed the Shadow Tiger, he only got 2 orbs, and the highest grade was rare. Slowly and gradually, as he became progressively stronger and capable of defeating first-order existences, the treasures he obtained became less and less in quantity, and the quality also steadily decreased. After holding on to the treasure orbs, Bai Zemin began to search for the mana stone in the head of the Shadow Tiger. This would be his 5th soul stone in case this monster had one. 1 came from the blazing beetle, 1 from the fast mantis, 2 from 2 of all the mutated dogs he had killed. Bai Zemin had picked them up today while cleaning up the area. Suddenly the sound of footsteps attracted his attention, and he looked back without stopping his movements in search of the soul stone. At a short distance, and approaching with regular steps, Shengwan Bingshui was walking through the zombie corpses with an indifferent gaze. The stark contrast between her white dress, silver hair, and her blood-stained surroundings was an exotic sight that could not be appreciated every day. Her attention went between him and the completely lifeless body of the Shadow Tiger. Her eyes had a strange glint in them, but due to her icy expression, it was hard to tell what was going on in her head. After she reached a few steps away, she stopped and watched his actions silently. Bai Zemin's eyes lit up, and his attention was stolen by the hard object he was touching inside the shadow tiger's skull. With a soft tug, he pulled out his blood-covered hand. However, this was ignored by him, and he focused on the dark, colored stone in his palm. His mouth curved slightly into a satisfied smile, and he stored his second first-order soul stone in a plastic bag next to the rest. He wasn't worried about separating them, as the difference in size and shape made it too obvious to identify the differences between each grade. "Did something happen?" he asked after he stood up and looked the woman in front of him directly in the eyes with confusion. She stopped looking at the shadow tiger's body and looked at him before slowly explaining. Lunch was delayed to give the others time to work with the blazing beetle. Currently, the process is going smoothly, but because it's been several hours, the survivors are starting to get hungry, so everyone is preparing to eat now. "I see." He nodded, finally understanding what she meant even if she didn't say it explicitly. "That's okay. Thanks for coming all this way to keep me informed." He smiled before turning around and grabbing the shadow tiger corpse by a paw before looking back at her and saying, "Let's go." Shengwan Bingshui looked at his actions and raised an eyebrow. She pointed at the monster's body and asked, "You want to eat that too?" Bai Zemin blinked in surprise and said in a low voice, "My idea was to use this monster's skin as protection at some point, but now that you mention it, I've never tasted the meat of a tiger in my life." Bai Zemin, Kai Jingyi, Fu Xiefeng, and Zhongde followed Shengwan Bingshui back to the pharmacy building where the group of survivors was. When the group of 5 arrived at the site, there were already many people sitting casually on large rubble rocks eating in wide mouthfuls, and others coming out with their food from inside the building before sitting down and started to eat just like the rest. Bai Zemin could notice the look of surprise on the students' faces when they saw the black-furred tiger being dragged by him with one hand. "Look, they even hunt a tiger. Isn't it a panther? Idiot, it's obviously a tiger that mutated. Shut up and eat before you have to go back to work." He ignored all this and left the shadow tiger's body near where the blazing beetle was. Currently, the blazing beetle had lost much of its protective shell, and the survivors had also begun cutting up the meat and were packing in plastic bags to be taken to the refrigerators later. Although it was still uncertain whether the meat was edible or not, as it had not yet been long enough for everyone to feel safe enough, Shengwan Bingshui decided that it was better to work on it beforehand to save time, and since the survivors were not doing anything productive, her idea was immediately approved by everyone. Bai Zemin received his bowl of rice, as well as a large piece of red meat, a smaller piece of white meat, and a steamed bun. After nodding to the people in the kitchen, he simply went to the roof of the building and sat there with the beautiful Lilith a short distance away. However, this did not last long, as Wu Yujin soon appeared on the spot and started chatting with him. As she didn't seem to have any bad intentions, nor did she seem to want to ask him for anything, Bai Zemin casually chatted with her about insignificant things during the slightly late lunch. After finishing his meal, he excused himself and returned to the place where he was before to continue cleaning the area. This time he told Fu Xiefeng and the other 2 that one of them would switch places with Kong Lan and take her to level up. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The whole day passed exactly the same way as it started. Bai Zemin cleared small groups and considerably large groups of zombies, while practicing his control over mana and adapting to the use of blood manipulation in different circumstances. Slowly but surely he could notice steady improvement in his control over magic, as well as imagining and solidifying blood to form spears. When the sun went down, he finally decided to call it a day and return to the gym, casually meeting up with Chunhee's group and the rest who had returned several minutes earlier. Surprisingly, Shengwan Bingshui's group had also not been dawdling while the other survivors worked, as they had brought even more mattresses and clothes from the female dormitory. Now, thanks to the large movement of female students the day before, practically everyone had a place to lie down to sleep, and while it was not as comfortable as a bed, it was countless times more comfortable than the cold, hard ground. Little by little, the living conditions of the survivors improved, which made the heavy and gloomy atmosphere slowly lighten thanks to the new comforts as well as the power demonstrated by Bai Zemin and the other evolved ones. From about 7:30 in the morning until now, more than 14 hours have passed, but there hasn't been the slightest sign of adverse effect on the three scum who ate the beetle meat. Shangwan Bing Shui was sitting on a chair next to a table inside the cafeteria and began to announce the results of the experiment conducted today. Basically, can meat be eaten or not? Liang Peng asked in confusion. Shangwan Bing Shui looked at him before looking at the rest and continuing. During all this time, if something bad were to happen, at least there should have already been a minor indication. However, there's no change in skin color, no fever, the pupils did not dilate in any way, nor does there seem to be any kind of mental change. I think it is correct to assume that the flesh of mutated monsters is not harmful to the human body. Bai Zemin chuckled and said in a considerably cheerful tone, "That means that from today onwards we have another source of food, doesn't it?" "That's right." Shangwan Bing Shui nodded as she looked at everyone. Even her icy attitude was somewhat warmer at this moment, which proved how cheerful she was. RA with tilde new ES. The evolved animals and insects were from a certain point of view more terrifying than the zombies, since only one of them could devastate large groups of people in a short time. However, now they had also become an indispensable food source. Bai Zemin and the rest still didn't know how the mana had affected the land of the world in general, but Lilith had told him that it was possible for the crops to stop growing, as it was not something strange by any means. Therefore, if that happened, every meal they consumed was one less meal that could not be replenished. With the current situation in the world, the production factories would naturally cease to function, so they could not count on that kind of food either. Therefore, the most natural food was the meat of other species. Now that it had been confirmed that the meat of the first-order blazing beetle was edible, the joy and relief they felt was simply too great, as a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. Without food, people would not be willing to work, would not obey, and chaos would soon break out everywhere, which, considering the current situation of the world, would mean the destruction of the human race. But now that they knew they could get a safe food source from other animals, the problem had at least been alleviated a little more, and while it was not a long-term solution, at least for the moment, it was better than nothing. "By the way, what happened to those three guys?" Bai Zemin asked casually. "As promised, I let them go." Shangwan Bing Shui replied indifferently. Bai Zemin looked at her and asked in a strange tone, "They left at this time?" "That's right. Any problem?" She looked at him and asked in confusion, "Any problem?" Bai Zemin didn't know what to say, so he simply shook his head as he sneered at the three poor, pitiful guys. While it was true that he had cleared the southeast of the northern area, and his three subordinates had partially cleared the southwest area, at night the dangers abounded much more. Bai Zemin knew that three normal people, without even the courage to fight, would definitely not be able to survive during the night, unless they were lucky. But even if they survived the night danger, considering that there was no food around, it was only a matter of time before they died in one way or another. Today, Bai Zemin had also made sure that Kong Lan spent the 2 daily activations of her lesser healing skill on his left hand, and although she had again exhausted almost all of her mana, the results were as surprising as the first time, since his wrist had recovered between 80% and 90%, which meant that he only needed to be treated for 1 or 2 more days before fully recovering. Less than a week to recover from such a serious bone fracture. In the previous world, such a thing was simply unthinkable even with the most advanced medical treatments. But now, thanks to Bai Zemin's constant evolution, Kong Lan's high magical power, and her lesser healing skill, it was something that was happening before everyone's eyes. After a sleepless night, there was still a lot of work to do, so everyone woke up very early in the morning as soon as the first ray of sunlight came out. Just like the day before, after breakfast, the group of evolved fighters split into 2. One group led survivors to work with the flesh of the blazing beetle, and the other smaller group began to clear out the larger zombie waves blocking the way to the exit. The only difference was that this time the formation of the groups was different. The day before, because they were still unsure of the effect of the mutated insect meat, Shangwan Bing Shui, who was the person who had come up with the idea of eating it and conducting an experiment, had to be present all day. However, now that the doubts had been cleared up and they finally realized that the area around the pharmacy building was relatively safe, there was no longer any need for such protection. Therefore, Shangwan Bing Shui had also begun to clear the road, leading to the parking lot where the school buses and other cars that in the past belonged to students or teachers were located. After a full day, the group went back to rest, and when they woke up the next day, they split up again to continue working. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 10th day since the arrival of the soul record on Earth. After a little more than 3 days of cleanup, Shangwan Bing Shui, Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, and Zhongde had finally wiped out all the zombies in the southwestern area north of the university. Moreover, after being constantly healed by Kong Lan and thanks to his high health, Bai Zemin's broken hand had finally recovered completely, and he could move it so normally that no one would believe him if he said that a week ago his bones had almost turned to dust. "Oh, this will make the trip so much easier," Chenny exclaimed happily as he looked at the more than 10 buses and hundreds of cars neatly parked. Because the parking lot was underground, the zombies in this place were very few, and after some easy work, the area was cleared. If it weren't for the lack of amenities that prevented a human being from wanting to live here, this place could be considered the most suitable in the entire university. In fact, this solves a big problem. Bai Zemin nodded in agreement and sighed with secret relief. In order for his long-term plans to work properly, Bai Zemin needed help from other people. Besides, if he didn't help human beings whenever possible, then who was going to run the factories, water dams, and power plants as well as many other systems when the world recovered? He couldn't do that. Therefore, even if the safety of other people was not especially his concern, it was a task he had to accomplish. So far, the group of survivors rescued by Bai Zemin and the rest numbered around 500 or 600. However, getting them all out of the university would be too great a challenge. But with the addition of this fleet of buses, this problem had been almost completely solved. "Hey guys, bring those things and the tools." Liang Peng waved his hand and shouted toward the other corner. His loud voice echoed everywhere, and if there was a zombie hiding, it would undoubtedly have been attracted. Under his call, a large group of men dragged several metal pieces over a meter long that contained other smaller metal pieces inside. These metal pieces were, naturally, the shell of the first-order blazing beetle. After several days of work and effort, the more than 3 meters tall and more than 5 meters in length of the beetle had completely disappeared. Its flesh was being properly preserved, the shell had been saved, and even the large legs had been taken to the gymnasium to be turned into weapons later. As for the meat, everyone was surprised the first time they tasted it. The mutated elephant beetle meat was not only delicious and tender, but when they consumed it, everyone received some stat points, increasing their natural health by a couple of points. Even Bai Zemin received 1 health point back then. Although it was a pity that it only worked once, as they ate more of that meat, a normal person's body would become much healthier naturally, which was amazing. Seeing the amount of shell parts, Bai Zemin stretched his body and his bones thundered as he said, "All right, time to start working." More than 20 male students nodded and began to inspect the buses together with Liang Peng and Bai Zemin. This group consisted of people with some experience in mechanics, and all of them came from working backgrounds. "I think we should remove the front bumper, which is practically plastic, and exchange it for a metal one." "No, why don't we better create a pointed platform that covers the front and leave just the front window uncovered? But that would waste a lot of material, and I'm not sure it would be enough with the shell we have now. MMH. Not only that, the gears could come loose if we take the whole carcass apart." This, as he looked at Bai Zemin and Liang Peng fervently arguing with the other male students and naming words unknown to him, Chenny couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. ROE. Before the world suddenly changed, He was a model student who aimed to become someone important in the government in the future. In addition, because his family had enough money, he also didn't need to get a job, so he didn't have any knowledge about mechanics or automobiles. In the past, he drove a car that cost over 2 million Chinese yuan, and if it needed to be repaired, he would take it to the best service. How could he understand what they were talking about then? In China, A mechanic was a job generally chosen by unschooled people, and people generally did not look favorably on them. However, in this new world, knowledge of mechanics was countless times more valuable than the political knowledge Shun had acquired. What was previously viewed with somewhat disdainful eyes was now needed and praised, while what was once praised and a symbol of pride was now useless. Wu Yujin seemed to be able to understand the thoughts of her childhood friend, but in this case there were no words that could lift anyone's spirits. After all, Chun had always been outstanding in everything, and now that he was completely overshadowed, naturally it was too abrupt a change for him, and it would take time for him to get used to it. In fact, many of the girls who previously seemed to have some sort of feeling or admiration for him could not help but look at him again and compare him with Bai Zemin unconsciously. If it were 10 days ago, Bai Zemin would not even be worthy of the second look from the several beautiful women among the survivors. But now everything was different. Many could not help but wonder, in a world where death is as natural as breathing, is it better to pursue a handsome man or a man of greater capability? Chun was of course skilled. It was just that Bai Zemin was too overpowered. I'll go scout the exit path to the south, Chun said before turning around and leaving the scene, deciding that it was better to do what he asked to do. He too had his own strengths, and it was better to appreciate them rather than demean himself. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Time passed quickly. The morning was over and the afternoon was half over, but the sound of hammering, drilling, grinding, welding, as well as the sound of wheel nuts and screws falling to the ground could be heard everywhere in the university's subway parking lot. The group of about 22 people worked almost without rest and only stopped to eat when they were hungry, because the sooner they finished the job, the sooner they could leave the university grounds and finally get to know what the situation was like in the outside world. Apart from the 22 experienced in mechanics, there were also many more people helping to hold the metal parts in place or reaching for the objects and tools pointed out by any of them, which sped up the work process a lot more. One thing worth noting was that when they started working, Bai Zemin, Liang Peng, and the other 20 students received the following message, but with some differences. In the case of Bai Zemin in particular, it was this: you have learned the unclassified passive skill repair level 5. The soul record was an unknown entity that recorded all the experiences in the soul of each existence and converted it into statistics and skills capable of being evolved and studied in greater depth. Therefore, as people with experience in the field of mechanics, they naturally acquired a corresponding skill. Something similar had happened with the female students and male students who had helped in the kitchen. They acquired the passive skill cooking, and the level of the skill depended on the personal ability of each of them. The amazing thing about the soul record was that each person's ability could grow much faster compared to the past thanks to the existence of mana. The more they cooked, the more the cooking skill of those in charge of the kitchen grew steadily, and the more they hammered, the more the repair skill level of those they were modifying increased. This was another wonder of this strange, unknown entity known as the soul record. The appearance of the current buses was quite different when compared to the classic buses that were parked several hours ago. In the past, the vehicles were much safer from a certain point of view, as they were made of almost pure iron, while today's vehicles were made mainly of plastic and even fiberglass in some cases, which improved the appearance and comfort. Therefore, to better adapt to this new world and to everyone's needs, the front part of the buses have been almost completely removed and replaced by a large metal plate that left only the window and the headlights uncovered. In addition, all the other glass windows of the buses have been removed and replaced with a blazing beetle shell plate on each side. Although it was a pity that most of the metal hard shell had been used, the overall security of the 10 buses had taken a tremendous leap forward compared to the previous ones. Finally done, Bai Zemin looked at their work with a touch of satisfaction. Even though they didn't have all the necessary tools, it had turned out really well, and the 10 luxurious-looking buses now looked like 10 steel monsters. Good job. Wu Yujin approached with a small bottle of water and handed it to him with a charming smile. Thank you. He thanked her and smiled politely back before he began to survey the surroundings as he sipped water slowly. Bai Zemin saw that it wasn't just Wu Yujin. Gao Min, Li Na, Fan Wu, and many other students were handing out small closed bottles of water to each of those who helped modify the buses. At this point, everyone knew that they had to help in any way they could, not only to exponentially increase their chances of survival and improve their lives, but also not to be expelled from the group. Even those who were unwilling to leave the safety of the enclosed places worked, as long as it wasn't something that required going out in the open. Now we can finally get out of here. Shangwan Bing Shue's voice sounded from behind, and when Bai Zemin turned around, he saw her slowly approaching as she looked at the buses before looking back at him. A with grave nuobi. Good job. Although her voice was cold, at least she sounded sincere, and it would be a lie to say that Bai Zemin wasn't secretly surprised. This was the first time he had heard her say small words of praise, or at least towards him. While it wasn't much, it was a breakthrough as a group. It was what Bai Zemin believed. Yeah. He replied briefly, and before the conversation had a chance to progress, a roar from outside silenced all sound underground. Roar. Not good. One of the survivors in charge of standing guard near the entrance shouted in fright. Chun-He is fighting an ape over 10 feet tall. They're currently heading this way. Hearing the student's scream of terror and remembering the earlier roar, the survivors' faces turned pale as a sheet, and they quickly ran to the back and deeper part of the subway. Some of them fell to the ground, and a few were even stomped by those behind, being seriously injured and even dying in the process. After all, a stampede of over 500 people was no joke, and most of them had thought that Chun-He was an invincible existence. But since an ape forced him to retreat to this place, it meant that he was weaker, which made the survivors think that they were going to die. Liang Peng, Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, Zhongde, and Konglan quickly began to help those who could help and to beat up those who became disobedient or wanted to incite chaos in any way. This had been one of the rules and ideas that had been put forward not many days ago, and for the first time it was being implemented to avoid major panic. An ape of more than 10 feet? Chun-He? First order. Bai Zemin's mind flashed with that thought, and only now did he realize that the handsome archer was nowhere to be seen. Whoosh! Before he moved, a breeze rushed beside him, and the next thing Bai Zemin saw was Shangwan Bing Shui dashing at full speed to the exit. Her speed was at least 8 or 9 times faster than a normal person before the apocalypse, which meant that her agility stat was at least between 80 and 90 points. Although he was surprised, he also charged toward the exit. Like Shangwan Bing Shui, Bai Zemin was clear that it was absolutely impossible for Chun-He to cope with a first-order existence on his own. Although the archer had become more powerful after absorbing some of the first-order anti-magic zombies' soul power and defeating other enemies over the past few days, it was still not enough for him to survive against such a confrontation. The sound of roars and bangs was the first thing Bai Zemin could make out as he approached the exit of the subway parking structure. Furthermore, although it was barely distinguishable due to the overwhelming sound of what he assumed were the mutated ape's attacks, Bai Zemin could also faintly feel the sound of the wind being pierced by what he thought were Chun-He's arrows. A split second later, Shangwan Bing Shui's cold voice reached his ears, followed by a roar from the mutated ape. Obviously, her attack had managed to inflict enough damage for its roar to change. 2 seconds later, Bai Zemin finally reached the surface, and his footsteps paused for a moment to take in the surrounding situation. After all, he didn't want to die shamefully by rushing into battle without knowing what exactly was going on. The first thing that came into his line of sight was an ape that was clearly taller than the previous survivor had announced. Instead of 3 meters tall, the mutated ape easily reached 4 meters, and its muscles were explosive enough to crush a house with its fists. In addition, the mutated beast was covered in a large amount of silver-colored fur that glistened in the rays of the evening sunlight, giving it a majestic appearance. However, the ape's body was wounded. There were at least a dozen arrows firmly stuck in the beast's abdomen, chest, arms, shoulders, and legs, causing blood to flow constantly from those small holes. Bai Zemin narrowed his eyes and noticed that those arrows were not normal. A faint light of light blue shone on the outline of the arrow, which kept them steady and undestroyed by the fierce movements of the mutated ape. It must be the treasure Chun-He obtained, probably something that boosts his attacks in some way. Bai Zemin thought as his sight moved at lightning speed to the semi-frozen limbs of the giant ape. Bang! The giant ape brutally slammed the floor, right in front of him, and Chun-Yi hurriedly jumped to the side, almost getting crushed in the process. He stood up instantly after and ran several meters before pulling out an arrow from the quiver behind his back and firing it at full speed. When the arrow touched the bow, its dark brown color turned the same as the other arrows that were stuck in the mutated ape's body, confirming Bai Zemin's theory about boosting power. As for whether it was a treasure or a skill, he didn't know. Freeze! Shangwan Bing Shue's voice attracted his attention, and Bai Zemin arrived just in time to see a small golden-colored stick shooting out a blast of icy air. Roar! The ape roared, and its wild movements slowed a little, but still noticeably. Around its fur, Bai Zemin could see from a distance how some parts had frozen or were still in the process of freezing due to the icy air from before. A magic wand? Bai Zemin had that idea as he looked at the small stick in Shangwan Bing Shue's hands. He assumed that instead of increasing strength like his Xian Yuan sword, the magic wand should definitely increase magic and mana, or one of both stats. Instead of interrupting, Bai Zemin watched the battle unfold, as he also wanted to see how strong Chun-Yi and Shangwan Bing Shui had become over the past few days. The battle was quite close. The giant ape was pretty fast and seemed to be completely focused on hunting Chun-Yi, who was shooting arrows every time the opportunity presented to him instead of going after Shangwan Bing Shui, who was the person that really threatened its life. Bang! 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 Several one- or two-story buildings in the surrounding area were crushed under the giant ape's heavy and powerful fists or its agile kicks that seemed to contain the flexibility and speed of a whip, but the power of a giant mace. Bai Zemin was sure that even he would be seriously injured if he received one of those blows directly. Chun-Yi might not be able to compare with Bai Zemin, but he was certainly not weak by any means. The damage from his strange arrows was little but slowly accumulated, and the giant ape was losing more and more blood. Moreover, when it seemed that he was about to be crushed, he somehow managed to escape at the last second by using the terrain to his advantage. Of course, the reason why Chun-Yi could stand his ground and fight without having to run away as he did before or without being killed was all thanks to Shangwan Bing Shue's timely support. Otherwise, he would definitely not be able to do as much against the giant ape, considering that he was currently already at his limit even with support. The giant ape's movements had slowed down by at least 60%, and great parts of its body had been frozen with small icicles of ice. In addition, Shangwan Bing Shui occasionally set up small ice traps to restrain the monster or shot sharp ice pikes, creating small wounds and freezing the blood inside little by little. Unfortunately, Bai Zemin knew that it was not so simple to end the life of a first-order existence, because the giant ape had yet to show any skills. OBEs. Indeed, Bai Zemin's thoughts proved to be true not long after. Roar! The ape stopped its movements and raised its head to the sky as it roared fiercely. Its silver fur that had been soiled with its own blood and the areas frozen by Shangwan Bing Shue's magic spells were surrounded by a strange white light that flashed with such fervor that it seemed to want to compete against the sun, forcing anyone who looked directly at it to close their eyes. When the bright flash calmed down and everyone was able to open their eyes again, Chun-Yi could not help but take several steps back as Shangwan Bing Shue's eyes widened slightly in disbelief. I see. So that's the skill this ape obtained when it advanced to First Order. Bai Zemin muttered to himself and couldn't help but secretly feel a bit of fear as he realized what the giant ape's skill was. The giant ape's skill was very simple. It didn't increase its strength, nor did it increase its speed or defense, nor did it give it any kind of elemental control. It was a skill that could only be used on itself. Regeneration. The skill that the giant mutated ape had acquired during its evolution gave it the ability to recover from seemingly any wound. What was worse than a strong enemy? A strong enemy that could recover from the wounds you had inflicted on it after working so hard and risking your life so many times to do so. The silver fur that was covered with blood and ice patches now looked perfect, as if it had never faced any enemy in the first place. However, Bai Zemin noticed that the beast was breathing erratically, and the madness in its eyes seemed to have dimmed, being replaced by tiredness. Although the active skill of the giant mutated ape was undoubtedly powerful to the point that it could make an enemy despair after a close and hard battle, it was also a skill that consumed a great deal of mana and probably stamina as well. At least this was the conclusion to which Bai Zemin himself had come to after studying every sign shown by the beast after the activation of the skill. The monster's body was no longer firmly standing. Its limbs trembled slightly. Its breathing was agitated to the point where steam was coming out of its nostrils, etc. These were all signs of exhaustion. However, Bai Zemin narrowed his eyes and realized that he only had about 3 or 4 arrows in his quiver, which meant that he could no longer continue fighting. Furthermore, Shengwan Bing Shui herself had exhausted quite a bit of mana, and although she could still stay in battle, her chest was also rising and falling somewhat erratically with each of her breaths. Although they could not defeat the mutated giant ape, if it were another beast, the odds of being victorious would probably be higher or lower, depending on the type of enemy and its skill. The problem with first-order creatures was that you never knew what you were going to face until you faced it. The giant ape suddenly turned and began to run south. Considering its height and its human-like and even more flexible mobility, it was only a matter of time before it disappeared from everyone's sight. Shangwan Bing Shui's face turned ugly as she saw her prey about to flee. She had expended 70% to 80% of her mana, but she was confident of overcoming. However, if the giant mutated ape wanted to flee, she had no confidence in being able to stop it. Chains! An indifferent voice sounded from the back, near the entrance to the subway parking area. Chunhe and Shangwan Bing Shui did not need to turn around to know who the owner of that voice was after having lived and spent so much time together for almost half a month. Whoosh! 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 Suddenly, the blood that the giant mutated ape had lost during the battle moved strangely, and as if they were snakes with a will of their own, they rose from the ground and began to surround the beast's limbs. 2 red chains that glowed like rubies coiled tightly around the upper limbs, while 4 chains clung tightly around the lower limbs of the giant mutated ape, sealing its movements. Roar! The beast looked towards the source of mana's movement required for magical activation and roared with bloodshot eyes as it struggled with all its strength, causing the blood chains to begin cracking violently. However, the current Bai Zemin was no longer the same Bai Zemin from before who barely had any knowledge about mana and his skill. Reinforce! Bai Zemin muttered under his breath, and the blood on the ground merged with the already formed bloody chains, repairing the cracks and making them stronger. For the past few days, Bai Zemin had been practicing control over mana and his blood manipulation practically nonstop, only stopping to sleep and to eat his daily meals. The rest of the time was spent by him using zombies as a source of training. At first, it was difficult and extremely frustrating to see how his efforts were worthless. Then he couldn't help but think in Shangwan Bing Shui and noticed that every time she created something out of ice, she would say the name of her creation out loud, or when she sent the ice bullets flying, she would wave her hand. It was then that an idea flashed in his mind, and, copying her ways, he began to train by saying the name of what he was imagining every time he used his blood manipulation skill. In doing so, Bai Zemin was pleasantly surprised to realize how much easier it made his task, as he could divert more of his focus to the mana within his body to resonate with that of his surroundings, and the activation of his skill consumed significantly less effort and mana than normal. After approximately 3 days of virtually nonstop training, the fruits of his efforts began to slowly manifest, and at this point he was shining. Seeing Shangwan Bing Shui and Chunhe fighting, Bai Zemin realized that both of them, especially her, were strong to the point of being geniuses. But in fact, the difference with him was still quite large. With such a difference in power, there was no need to hide his power so much, and the more he showed, the better it would be, as the less they would dare to plan against him in the future. He threw a bottle of blood into the air and stretched his hand upward as he slowly said, "Spear." Bang! The bottle exploded, and the liquid blood was surrounded by a wave of mana. In less than a second, the blood coalesced and hardened, taking the shape of a firm, pointed spear over 2 meters long. This spear even had a faint red glow around it since he had consumed over 80 mana points to make it. One could imagine the hidden power of the weapon. When the blood spear fell into his hands after descending, Bai Zemin brought his right hand with the spear as far back as possible, just above his shoulder, and with his left foot, he took a big step forward, turning his body 360 degrees, and after finishing the turn, the spear shot forward at full speed. However, before the spear completely left his hand, the blazing ring in his right hand flashed, and a crimson flame covered the spear in its entirety. Boom! With almost 100 strength points, and having expended almost the same amount of mana, the spear created with the Shadow Tiger's blood raised a small boom as it went beyond what the surrounding air pressure was able to withstand. A crimson line filled with burning heat closed the distance in a second, and before the giant ape could react, the spear had firmly penetrated its head. But that was not all. Boom! The spear filled with fire-like energy blasted, and the beast's head exploded into countless pieces. The pieces of burnt flesh and the smell of blood floated in the air. The blood chains holding the beast upright vanished, and the practically headless body fell noisily to the ground, collapsing onto a pile of rubble and raising a cloud of dust in the process. Chinny's eyes and mouth were wide open comically, and the disbelief in his gaze expressed how great was the shock he had received. Tap, tap, tap. Shangwan Bing Shui turned her head slightly towards the source of the sound of light footsteps, and her blue eyes shivered for a moment as she saw the relaxed smile on the face of the young man behind her. Bai Zemin had a casual smile and even rested his free hand comfortably inside his pants pocket, as if what he had just done was no big deal. He became stronger in this week. Was the thought of Shangwan Bing Shui and Chun He as they recalled what they had just witnessed, both feeling complicated emotions. Indeed, Bai Zemin had become stronger than he was several days ago. His physical or magical stats had not changed in any way, and he had not leveled up either since he was currently in a vortex, which once completely overcome, he could evolve into a more powerful existence, but in the meantime, he could not acquire any power boosts. In fact, he had not even used his available status points in any way to boost his natural stats. However, in this world, there were many ways to become stronger without leveling up, without acquiring soul power or stats, even without treasures or obtaining skill scrolls. One of those ways was to learn and use what one already had in the most optimal way possible. Bai Zemin was training precisely to become stronger in this way, and although he still had a long way to go, it was undoubtedly a breakthrough compared to the past. In addition, Bai Zemin had also been practicing other types of attacks using the skills he had along with his treasures, creating amazing effects. In fact, the previous attack was just an improvised blazing blood spear. But he had planned something much more powerful by making use of those two skills and adding something else as an intensifier. You have acquired the soul power of First Order Platinum Ape level 37. You cannot level up or obtain additional stats before you get the First Order job. You have learned unclassified passive skill level 5, Throwing. 3 glowing orbs filled with soul power came out of the lifeless body of the First Order Platinum Ape and went into the bodies of Bai Zemin, Shangwan Bing Shui, and Chun He respectively, the size of the orbs being quite similar to each other with barely any almost indistinguishable difference. In addition, another message flashed in Bai Zemin's retina. Although he was somewhat surprised, the surprise was not that great since he had somehow expected something like this to happen. The reason? Of course, the beautiful and seductive Lilith. She had explained to him more about the world of skills, and thanks to that now, Bai Zemin's knowledge had increased as a consequence. A person could not only learn skills by training, but could also learn through skill scrolls after defeating enemies, and skills could evolve. However, there were exceptions to this rule. Ignoring the world around him, Bai Zemin took a look at the new skill as this was something he was looking forward to because this skill would be of great help for his evolution to First Order. Throwing unclassified passive skill. Level 5. When throwing an object with your bare hands, you have a 20% probability of dealing a critical hit to the enemy. This skill has reached its maximum point and cannot evolve on its own. To some extent, it was also something that he already expected. However, The impossibility of evolving alone was something that surprised him, and now he finally understood several things that Lilith had explained to him about the soul record and the skills. Apart from the individual stats, there were also other stats that were not displayed in the window of each person or intelligent creature. An example of this was the critical hit statistic, defense, attack damage, etc. To acquire these stats, one needed to obtain certain skills or certain items that were usually not formed after the defeat of an enemy and the intervention of the soul record and the soul power of the loser. For example, a blacksmith or artifact maker could create weapons, armor, accessories, which increased physical damage or defense, but did not increase stats such as strength or stamina and health that treasures created from soul power could increase. Lilith said that the higher existences referred to these statistics as tracking statistics, as they could only constantly track these statistics by looking at one's skills and equipment. This was precisely the reason why such jobs or classes were considered a rarity and prized on all worlds, since the soul record was a righteous entity that allowed anyone who had talent and used it in the right way and with the right materials to become powerful. Even someone who did not have the courage to fight powerful enemies could become empowered as long as they knew or possessed a class of artifact crafting or blacksmithing and similar. Bai Zemin sighed as he realized how many things he had yet to know and how many other things he had yet to come into contact with. Although he might seem extremely strong, even though it was true that Lilith's advanced information was very helpful to him, the reality was that all this also had a counterproductive side effect, and that was that he started to realize early on that what weighed on his shoulders was bigger and bigger than he had imagined at the beginning. RNB. Bai Zemin, are you okay? Bai Zemin snapped out of his daze and looked back with a casual smile. Why wouldn't I be? I didn't even face that ape head-on, and all I did was deal the final strike. Is that so? Shangwan Bing Shui furrowed her eyebrows slightly before nodding. If you say so. For a moment she had seemed to see him depressed, which had struck her as peculiar considering the overwhelming strength he had just demonstrated and how easily he had claimed the life of the First Order Platinum Ape. Even if it was true that the beast had been largely exhausted by her and Chun-He previously, a First Order existence was still a First Order existence, tired or not. But she soon rejected that thought after hearing his reply and took it as a wrong thought of hers. Bai Zemin bent down and picked up the 3 objects dropped by the Platinum Ape. Surprisingly, the First Order beast had dropped 3 items: a skill scroll, a red orb, and an orange orb. Chun-He, is it okay if we divide these 3 treasures and then tell us what happened? Yes. Chun-He nodded with a serious expression and said in a deep voice, leaving the university might be more difficult than we thought, and those 3 treasures, regardless of how weak they are, we will certainly need them. Bai Zemin and Shangwan Bing Shui looked at each other for a moment before looking back at Chun-He with a frown. Apparently, things were much more complex than they had previously expected. A normal treasure, a rare treasure, and a skill scroll. Let's see what kind of skill it is. Bai Zemin put the victory loot on a large pile of rubble that had collapsed and grabbed the skill scroll to see what skill it was before passing it to the rest. Regeneration, First Order active skill, level 5. Regenerates stamina according to the mana consumed. Every 2 mana points regain 1 stamina point. Bai Zemin couldn't help but frown hard at the sight of the skill that had formed after the sublimation of the Platinum Ape's remaining soul power. This was something he definitely did not expect, and honestly, the skill looked quite weak compared to his blood manipulation, even though they were skills of the same level and order. Flash! Flash! After 2 small squeezes, the 2 orbs burst into flashes of orange and red light before 2 new objects appeared on the pile of rubble.